Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to another deeply unsettling journey into the darkest corners of human consciousness. Tonight, we're exploring something that'll probably make you question whether you should trust every voice that visits you in your sleep. We're diving into the disturbing world of people who claim their dreams told them to kill. Now, before you settle in for what might be the most unsettling bedtime story you've ever heard, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe, but only if you're genuinely drawn to these twisted tales of nocturnal madness. And drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from tonight and what time it is in your corner of the world. I always love hearing from our global community of midnight storytellers and insomniacs. Get comfortable, dim those lights, and prepare to explore the thin line between divine inspiration and dangerous delusion. And if you find yourself drifting off somewhere along the way, well, that's exactly what we're hoping for here, though you might want to keep one eye open tonight. You know, there's something deeply unsettling about the idea that our dreams, those strange, uncontrollable theaters of the mind, might sometimes whisper the most terrible instructions. Dreams don't just entertain us or confuse us. Sometimes they command us. And when they do, the results can be absolutely devastating. So let's begin this dark exploration with a question that's haunted humanity for millennia. When does divine inspiration become dangerous delusion? Tonight, we'll find out. Let's start with one of the most heartbreaking and disturbing cases in modern criminal history. Andrea Yates, a Texas mother who drowned her 5 children in 2001, after months of dreams that she claimed were divine commands to save their souls from eternal damnation. Andrea Yates wasn't a monster when her story began. She was a former nurse, a devout Christian, and by all accounts a loving mother who homeschooled her children and read them Bible stories every night before tucking them into bed. She was the kind of woman who volunteered at church functions, helped neighbors with their groceries, and sent handwritten thank you notes for birthday gifts. But she was also suffering from severe postpartum psychosis, a condition so debilitating and reality distorting that the line between divine revelation and dangerous delusion had become completely invisible. Picture this, a suburban house in Clear Lake, Texas, where everything looked normal from the outside. Andrea would wake up every morning, make breakfast for her 5 children, Noah, John, Paul, Luke, and Mary, and begin their daily homeschool routine. She would help them with mathematics, read them stories, and guide them through Bible verses. To any observer, she was a dedicated mother managing a busy household with remarkable skill and patience. But what nobody could see was the war raging inside Andrea's mind, especially when she closed her eyes to sleep. For months before the tragedy, Andrea had been experiencing what she described as visitations in her dreams, encounters, so vivid and terrifying that they felt more real than her waking life. These weren't ordinary nightmares about monsters or falling off cliffs. They were elaborate, detailed scenarios where supernatural beings would engage her in complex theological discussions about sin, salvation, and the eternal fate of her children's souls. In these dreams, Satan himself would appear to Andrea, sometimes manifesting as a dark figure with burning red eyes that seemed to penetrate her very soul, sometimes taking the form of a well-dressed businessman who spoke with the persuasive charm of a television evangelist. The devil's appearance would shift and change throughout each dream, but his message remained consistently terrifying. Her children were already marked for damnation. The dreams weren't just frightening visions. They were comprehensive presentations, complete with visual evidence of her children's supposed spiritual corruption. Satan would show Andrea glimpses of the future, horrific scenes where she could watch her beloved children growing up to become criminals, drug addicts, murderers, and sexual predators. She would see Noah dealing drugs on street corners, John beating his wife in a fit of rage, Paul molesting children in a church basement, Luke robbing convenience stores at gunpoint, and Mary working as a prostitute in downtown Houston. These weren't brief, abstract visions. The dreams were feature-length presentations where Andrea could observe her children's future lives in excruciating detail. She would watch Noah's first drug deal, see the exact moment when John's anger turned violent, witness Paul's first assault on an innocent child. The devil would provide running commentary throughout these visions, explaining how each child's corruption was inevitable, how their innocent souls were already being claimed by forces of evil that Andrea couldn't prevent or control. But the most insidious aspect of these dreams was how they gradually introduced the solution that would haunt Andrea's sleeping mind for months. After showing her vision after vision of her children's future damnation, Satan would step back and allow another voice to enter the dream, a voice that identified itself sometimes as God, sometimes as Jesus, sometimes as an unnamed angel sent to guide her through this impossible situation. This divine voice would explain the theological problem with heartbreaking clarity. Andrea's children were indeed destined for corruption and damnation, but not because they were inherently evil, because the world itself was evil, and it would inevitably corrupt their innocent souls as they grew older. The voice would show Andrea the precise spiritual mechanics of how sin would enter her children's hearts, how their natural goodness would be twisted into selfishness, cruelty, and moral blindness. The dreams became increasingly sophisticated in their theological arguments. The divine voice would cite specific Bible verses, reference complex doctrinal concepts, and provide detailed explanations of how salvation actually worked in God's cosmic plan. Andrea would find herself engaged in deep theological discussions while sleeping, debates about the nature of sin, the requirements for salvation, and the terrible responsibility that mothers bear for their children's eternal welfare. And then came the solution that would transform Andrea's maternal love into something unspeakably tragic. The divine voice would explain that there was indeed a way to save her children's souls, but it required the ultimate sacrifice from a loving mother. If Andrea killed her children while they were still innocent, before the world could corrupt them, their souls would go directly to heaven, bypassing all the future sins that would otherwise damn them to eternal torment. The dream logic was cruel and seductive in its apparent mercy. Andrea would see her children as adults, suffering in hell for sins they hadn't yet committed, Noah screaming as demons tore at his flesh, John weeping in eternal isolation, Paul burning in lakes of fire, Luke and Mary tortured for crimes that existed only in her sleeping visions. Then she would see the same children as radiant angels in heaven, their faces glowing with divine light, their voices raised in eternal songs of praise and gratitude. In these heavenly visions, her children would thank her for saving them from earthly corruption. They would explain how her sacrifice had given them eternal joy instead of eternal suffering, how her act of love had rescued them from fates worse than death. The children would assure Andrea that they understood her choice, that they were grateful for her courage, that her temporary grief was nothing compared to their eternal happiness. The dreams became more frequent and more detailed as Andrea's postpartum psychosis deepened. She would experience these theological visions every night, sometimes multiple times per night, until the boundary between sleep and waking consciousness began to dissolve completely. She would find herself thinking about her dream conversations during the day, checking Bible verses to confirm the theological arguments she had heard while sleeping, and gradually becoming convinced that her dreams represented genuine divine communication. Andrea's husband Rusty later testified that she had tried to discuss her dreams with him, but he had dismissed them as stress-related nightmares brought on by the challenges of raising 5 young children. He encouraged her to see their pastor, but the pastor had also interpreted her dreams as spiritual struggles rather than symptoms of severe mental illness. The religious community around Andrea lacked the psychological training to recognize that her vivid theological dreams were actually manifestations of postpartum psychosis. What made Andrea's situation particularly tragic was that her dreams exploited her deepest maternal instincts and her sincere religious faith. She wasn't dreaming about harming her children out of anger or resentment. She was dreaming about saving their eternal souls through the ultimate act of sacrificial love. Her psychosis had transformed motherhood itself into a theological crisis where love and murder became indistinguishable. The dreams also provided Andrea with detailed practical instructions about how to carry out what she believed was God's plan. She would see herself filling the family bathtub with water, calling each child individually and holding them underwater until they stopped struggling. The divine voice would explain that drowning was the most merciful method because it was quick and relatively painless, and because water represented spiritual purification in Christian symbolism. These practical visions were remarkably specific. Andrea could see exactly how to position each child in the bathtub, how to hold them firmly but gently, how to avoid causing unnecessary fear or pain. The dreams had essentially provided her with step-by-step instructions for committing what she believed was the ultimate act of maternal sacrifice. On the morning of June 20th, 2001, after Rusty left for work, Andrea began what she believed was the most loving act any mother could perform. She filled the family bathtub with water and called her youngest child, 6-month-old Mary, first. She held the baby underwater until she drowned, then placed Mary's body on her bed and called for 4-year-old Luke, one by one. Andrea drowned each of her children exactly as she had seen in her dreams. Luke, then Paul, then John, and finally 7-year-old Noah, who was old enough to understand what was happening and tried to run away before his mother caught him and carried him to the same bathtub where his siblings had died. When police arrived, they found Andrea sitting calmly at the kitchen table, her hair still damp from the bathroom, waiting to be arrested. She immediately confessed to drowning her children and explained that she had followed God's instructions to save their souls from corruption and damnation. She showed no emotion during her initial questioning, convinced that she had performed a sacred duty that required her to sacrifice her own happiness for her children's eternal welfare. The trial that followed became a complex examination of the relationship between religious faith and mental illness. Andrea's defense team argued that she was legally insane at the time of the murders, driven by religious delusions and command hallucinations that had been reinforced by months of dream instructions that felt more real than her everyday experiences. The prosecution countered that Andrea's actions were deliberate and premeditated, pointing to evidence that she had planned the murders carefully and had waited until she was alone with the children before carrying out her plan. They argued that her claims about divine dreams were simply an attempt to avoid responsibility for calculated acts of murder. Psychiatric experts who examined Andrea found clear evidence of severe postpartum psychosis, including visual and auditory hallucinations, religious delusions, and complete inability to distinguish between reality and her psychotic experiences. Her dreams about divine commands weren't isolated incidents, but part of a broader pattern of psychological symptoms that had been building for months. What made the case particularly disturbing was how Andrea's religious community had unknowingly reinforced her delusions. When she had tried to discuss her troubling dreams, well-meaning church members had encouraged her to pray more, read her Bible more carefully, and trust in God's plan for her family. Nobody recognized that her increasingly intense religious experiences were actually symptoms of a dangerous mental illness. The theological content of Andrea's delusions also made them particularly resistant to treatment. Because her visions were rooted in legitimate Christian doctrines about sin and salvation, it was difficult for mental health professionals to challenge her beliefs without appearing to attack her faith. Her psychosis had essentially weaponized her religious convictions, turning her deepest spiritual beliefs into justifications for the most terrible acts. Andrea was initially convicted of capital murder and sentenced to life in prison, but the conviction was overturned on appeal in 2005 due to false testimony by a prosecution expert witness. In her second trial in 2006, she was found not guilty by reason of insanity and committed to a state mental hospital, where she remains today. Her case became a watershed moment in understanding postpartum psychosis and the dangerous intersection of mental illness and religious delusion. Medical professionals began developing better screening procedures for detecting postpartum mental health problems, and religious communities started training clergy to recognize when spiritual struggles might actually be symptoms of psychological disorders. But perhaps most importantly, Andrea's case forced society to confront uncomfortable questions about how we distinguish between religious faith and mental illness. When dreams become indistinguishable from divine revelation, when sleeping visions feel more real than waking reality, when love and murder become theologically equivalent, the results can destroy entire families in the name of salvation. The tragedy of Andrea Yates reminds us that dreams don't just happen to us. Sometimes they possess us completely, overriding every instinct, every moral boundary, every connection to reality. And when they do, when our sleeping minds become convinced that they're receiving instructions from God Himself, the consequences can be absolutely devastating for everyone we love most. Today, Andrea Yates remains in a Texas mental health facility where she receives treatment for her ongoing mental illness. She has expressed remorse for her actions while maintaining that she believes she was following divine commands at the time. Her case continues to influence how the legal system handles defendants who claim religious justification for their crimes, and how medical professionals approach the treatment of severe postpartum mental health disorders. The bathtub where Andrea drowned her 5 children has been removed from the house, but the questions her case raised about dreams, delusion, and divine command continue to haunt anyone who tries to understand how maternal love can be transformed into the most unthinkable tragedy. Moving from maternal madness to metropolitan terror, let's explore the case of David Berkowitz, better known as the son of Sam, a serial killer who terrorized New York City in the 1970s while claiming his murders were commanded by demons, speaking through his neighbor's dog. But here's where most people get the story wrong. They focus on the dog, when the real foundation of Berkowitz's killing spree began with recurring nightmares that established his connection to what he believed were ancient demonic forces. Now you might be thinking, wait, isn't this the guy who said a dog told him to kill people? And yes, that's the story that made headlines and turned David Berkowitz into a household name. But what the media largely ignored, and what Berkowitz himself revealed years later during psychological evaluations, was that his relationship with the demon dog actually began through a series of extraordinarily vivid dreams where a massive black dog would appear in his bedroom, speaking in a deep, commanding voice that identified itself as a 6,000-year-old demon named Sam. David Berkowitz was already a troubled young man long before the demon dog dreams began infiltrating his sleep. Born Richard David Falco in 1953, he was the illegitimate son of a Jewish woman who gave him up for adoption immediately after birth. The couple who adopted him, Nathan and Pearl Berkowitz, renamed him David and tried to provide a stable, loving home, but the psychological damage of abandonment had already taken root in ways that would prove catastrophic decades later. Growing up in the Bronx, young David showed early signs of what psychologists would later recognize as severe attachment disorders and antisocial behavior patterns. He was obsessed with fire, setting hundreds of small blazes throughout his childhood and adolescence. He kept detailed diaries documenting each fire he set, describing the flames, the smoke, the sound of sirens, and most disturbingly, his own emotional responses to watching destruction unfold. But David's pyromaniac tendencies were just the visible surface of much deeper psychological problems. He struggled with feelings of abandonment and rage that he couldn't understand or articulate. He had violent fantasies about hurting people, particularly women, though he had never acted on these impulses. He was socially isolated, academically mediocre, and increasingly convinced that he was fundamentally different from other people in ways that made normal relationships impossible. After graduating high school, David briefly joined the Army, where his psychological problems became more apparent. Military psychologists noted his difficulty forming relationships, his obsession with weapons, and his tendency toward paranoid thinking. He was discharged after 3 years of unremarkable service, but the military experience had introduced him to firearms and given him basic marksmanship training that would later prove deadly. When David returned to New York in 1974, he was a 21-year-old man with no clear direction, no meaningful relationships, and a growing sense that he was destined for something terrible. He worked a series of menial jobs: security guard, taxi driver, postal worker, but couldn't maintain steady employment because of his increasingly erratic behavior and his inability to interact normally with coworkers and supervisors. It was during this period of isolation and mounting psychological pressure that the demon dog dreams began. David would later describe these as the most vivid and terrifying experiences of his life, dreams so realistic that he would wake up convinced that supernatural forces had actually visited his bedroom and spoken to him directly. The dreams always followed the same basic pattern: but they grew more detailed and specific over time. David would find himself lying in his bed, unable to move, as a massive black dog materialized at the foot of his mattress. This wasn't an ordinary dog. It was the size of a small horse, with eyes that glowed red in the darkness and breath that smelled like sulfur and decay. The creature's presence filled the room with an oppressive sense of evil that made David feel like he was suffocating. But the most terrifying aspect of these dreams wasn't the dog's appearance. It was its voice. The creature would speak in what David described as an ancient, commanding voice that seemed to emanate from deep within the earth itself. The voice was simultaneously whispered and thunderous, as if the demon was speaking directly into David's mind while also shaking the foundations of the building. The demon would introduce itself as Sam, explaining that it was an ancient entity that had been influencing human behavior for thousands of years. Sam would describe its long history of commanding mortals to commit acts of violence, claiming responsibility for wars, murders, and massacres throughout human history. The demon would explain that David had been chosen as its latest instrument, selected because of his isolation, his anger, and his susceptibility to supernatural influence. These weren't brief, abstract conversations. The dreams were elaborate theological and philosophical discussions where Sam would explain the nature of evil, the purpose of violence, and David's role in a cosmic plan that transcended human understanding. The demon would describe the world as a battleground between forces of order and chaos, claiming that random violence was necessary to maintain the balance between these opposing powers. Sam would show David detailed visions of New York City, but not the city as it appeared during the day. In these dreams, David could see the spiritual reality underlying the physical world, streams of corruption flowing through the streets, auras of sin surrounding certain individuals and areas of the city that were spiritually polluted and needed to be cleansed through violence. The demon's instructions were remarkably specific and practical. Sam would show David maps of New York City with certain areas highlighted in red, explaining that these were locations where his work needed to be focused. The demon would describe the exact types of victims to target: young women with long dark hair, couples parked in cars, people who looked happy and carefree, and explain why these particular individuals needed to be eliminated. But Sam wasn't just giving general guidance. The demon provided detailed tactical instructions that revealed sophisticated knowledge of police procedures, ballistics, and criminal investigation techniques. Sam would specify the type of weapon to use, a .44 caliber revolver, explain how to approach victims without being detected, describe optimal escape routes, and even provide advice about how to avoid leaving forensic evidence. What made these dreams particularly disturbing was their interactive nature. Unlike ordinary nightmares where events simply unfold, David could ask questions and receive detailed answers. When he expressed doubts about the killings, Sam would show him visions of New York City consumed by fire and chaos, explaining that only through strategic murder could the city be purified and saved from complete spiritual destruction. The demon would also provide David with elaborate justifications for each potential killing. Sam would explain that the young couples he was instructed to target weren't innocent victims but spiritual pollutants, whose happiness and love were somehow offensive to cosmic order. The demon would show David visions of these couples' supposed future crimes, claiming that killing them preemptively would prevent greater evil from occurring. These theological justifications became increasingly complex as the dreams continued. Sam would cite ancient texts, reference obscure religious concepts, and provide detailed explanations of how violence served divine purposes that human minds couldn't fully comprehend. The demon would explain that David's reluctance to kill was understandable but misguided, that his human compassion was preventing him from fulfilling his cosmic destiny. Between July 1976 and July 1977, David Berkowitz killed 6 people and wounded 7 others, always following the patterns established in his demon dog dreams. He would target young couples in parked cars, approaching from the shadows with his .44 caliber revolver and firing multiple shots before disappearing into the night. The attacks were random in terms of victim selection, but followed a specific methodology that David claimed came directly from his dream instructions. Each murder followed the same ritual pattern that Sam had taught him in dreams. David would spend hours driving around the areas the demon had highlighted, looking for the specific types of victims Sam had described. He would park his car several blocks away, approach on foot, and position himself exactly as the demon had instructed. After the shooting, he would return to his car and drive home, where he would wait for Sam to appear in his dreams again. After each murder, David would experience what he called confirmation dreams, where Sam would express satisfaction with the killings and provide instructions for the next attack. These dreams served as positive reinforcement, convincing David that he was successfully fulfilling his supernatural mission and earning the demon's approval. The dreams also evolved to include specific instructions about communicating with police and media. Sam would dictate letters that David should leave at crime scenes, messages that would explain the supernatural nature of the killings and establish his identity as the son of Sam. These letters weren't David's own ideas, but direct dictation from the demon during his sleeping visions. The letters David left at crime scenes perfectly matched the theological tone and content of his demon dog dreams. They referenced ancient evil, cosmic purposes, and the necessity of purifying New York City through violence. Police initially thought the letters were the ravings of a madman, but they were actually faithful transcriptions of the conversations David had been having with Sam in his dreams for months. What made David's case particularly bizarre was how his waking life began to mirror his dream experiences. He started believing that his neighbor's dog, a real animal named Harvey, was the earthly vessel through which Sam communicated with him. The boundary between his dream demons and physical reality became completely blurred as his psychological condition deteriorated. David would spend hours staring at Harvey, waiting for signs that the dog was about to deliver supernatural messages. He would interpret the animal's barking as demonic communication and claim that he could see Sam's glowing red eyes looking out through Harvey's normal brown ones. His delusion had created a bridge between his sleeping visions and his waking paranoia. The Son of Sam killings terrorized New York City throughout 1976 and 1977, creating a climate of fear that changed how people lived their daily lives. Young couples stopped parking in isolated areas, women with long dark hair dyed their hair or wore wigs, and gun sales skyrocketed as people tried to protect themselves from a killer who seemed to strike randomly and disappear without a trace. Police established a massive task force dedicated to catching the Son of Sam, but David's dream-derived tactical knowledge helped him evade capture for over a year. Sam had taught him police procedures, investigation techniques, and surveillance methods that allowed him to stay one step ahead of law enforcement despite leaving obvious clues at crime scenes. The case finally broke when David received a parking ticket near the scene of his final attack. Police cross-referenced the ticket with their suspect profiles and identified David as a potential perpetrator. When officers arrived at his apartment on August 10, 1977, they found him sitting calmly in his car, waiting to be arrested as if he had been expecting them. During his initial interrogation, David immediately confessed to all the Son of Sam killings and began explaining about the demon dog dreams that had commanded his actions. He led police to his neighbor's apartment and pointed to Harvey, claiming that this ordinary pet was the earthly vessel through which a 6,000-year-old demon had been communicating with him for over a year. Police and psychiatric evaluators initially dismissed David's demon dog story as an obvious insanity defense, but the consistency and detail of his dream narrative suggested something more complex than simple fabrication. David could describe his supernatural encounters with extraordinary precision, providing theological and philosophical details that seemed beyond the capacity of someone with his limited education and intelligence. During his psychological evaluation, psychiatrists struggled to determine whether David was genuinely psychotic or simply using an elaborate supernatural mythology to avoid the death penalty. His dreams were so detailed and internally consistent that they seemed to represent either severe mental illness or the most sophisticated false memory system ever documented. The demon dog dreams had created their own internal logic that answered every question and resolved every contradiction. When psychiatrists challenged David's story, he would reference specific conversations with Sam that addressed their exact concerns. The dream mythology had become so comprehensive that it functioned as a complete alternative reality with its own rules and explanations. Years later, after serving decades in prison, David recanted the demon dog story, claiming that he had invented it to cover up his real motive, a desperate need for attention and notoriety. He explained that the Son of Sam killings were actually motivated by his anger at women and his desire to become famous, regardless of the cost in human lives. But David never fully explained how he had developed such an elaborate and consistent mythology around the dream commands, leaving open the possibility that his original story contained elements of psychological truth. Some experts believe that David's supernatural narrative was his mind's way of processing and justifying impulses that he couldn't acknowledge or understand through normal psychological mechanisms. The recantation also raised questions about the relationship between mental illness and criminal responsibility. If David's demon dog dreams were genuine psychotic experiences, then his later claims about fabricating the story might themselves be the product of psychological denial or therapeutic pressure to accept responsibility for his actions. The Son of Sam case became a cultural phenomenon that inspired countless books, movies, documentaries, and academic studies. David Berkowitz became one of the most famous serial killers in American history, but the psychological mechanisms underlying his crimes remain frustratingly mysterious and controversial. What makes David's story particularly disturbing from our perspective tonight is how his demon dog dreams created a complete theological framework for justifying murder. Unlike cases where mental illness produces random or chaotic violence, David's dreams provided him with systematic guidance that made killing seem not only acceptable but cosmically necessary. The dreams had transformed David's personal psychological problems into a supernatural mission that gave meaning and purpose to his violent impulses. Instead of seeing himself as a disturbed individual with antisocial tendencies, he believed he was a chosen instrument of ancient evil forces that were using him to accomplish important cosmic work. This transformation from personal pathology to supernatural mission is what made David's crimes so methodical and sustained. He wasn't killing in moments of rage or psychological breakdown. He was carrying out a careful plan that had been developed through months of dream, consultations with demonic advisors who provided tactical guidance and theological justification. The Son of Sam case reminds us that the most dangerous dream commands are often the ones that provide comprehensive worldviews rather than simple instructions. When our sleeping minds create entire mythologies that justify violence, when dreams become systematic ideologies rather than isolated experiences, the results can terrorize entire cities and destroy multiple families. Today, David Berkowitz remains in prison, where he has become a born-again Christian and claims to have found redemption through legitimate religious faith. He regularly gives interviews about his crimes and maintains that his current religious experiences are fundamentally different from the demonic dreams that commanded his killing spree. Whether this represents genuine spiritual transformation or another layer of psychological defense remains a subject of debate among criminal psychologists and religious counselors. The .44 caliber revolver that David used in his attacks was destroyed by police. But the questions his case raised about dreams, demons, and the nature of evil continue to haunt anyone who tries to understand how supernatural beliefs can be weaponized to justify the most terrible acts of violence. When our dreams start giving us homework, especially the kind that involves systematic murder campaigns, maybe it's time to question whether we're receiving cosmic revelations or just losing our grip on reality in the most dangerous possible way. Let's travel back in time to ancient Greece, where dreams and divine visions were considered legitimate sources of guidance for everything from military strategy to murder. At the Oracle of Delphi, the most famous prophetic site in the ancient world, dream-induced trances regularly led to pronouncements that would result in assassinations, wars, and mass killings that shaped the course of Western civilization. The Oracle of Delphi wasn't just one person, it was a succession of women called Pythia, who served as intermediaries between the gods and mortals for over 1,000 years. These women, chosen from among the local peasant population for their supposed spiritual purity and susceptibility to divine possession, would enter trance-like states and deliver prophecies that were considered direct messages from Apollo himself, the god of prophecy, music, and purification. But here's what most people don't understand about the Oracle of Delphi. Many of these world-changing prophetic trances were actually elaborate dream states induced by a combination of psychological preparation, ritual fasting, and most importantly, natural hallucinogenic gases that seeped from geological fissures beneath the temple. The Pythia wasn't just receiving divine visions. She was essentially experiencing chemically induced dreams that ancient Greek society treated as the absolute word of the gods. Picture the scene: a remote valley in central Greece, about 100 miles northwest of Athens, where Mount Parnassus rises dramatically from the surrounding landscape. The Greeks believed this was the center of the world, marked by a sacred stone called the omphalos, or navel stone. The Temple of Apollo was built directly over underground chambers where sweet-smelling vapors would rise from cracks in the earth vapors that modern scientists have identified as ethylene, a gas that produces euphoria, hallucinations, and trance-like states. The process of consultation at Delphi was elaborate and expensive, designed to build psychological pressure and spiritual expectation long before the Pythia ever entered her trance state. Pilgrims would travel for weeks or months to reach the oracle, often spending their life savings on the journey and the required offerings. They would undergo ritual purification in the sacred Castalian spring, offer expensive sacrifices to Apollo, and wait for days or weeks for their turn to present their questions to the god. When the appointed day arrived, the Pythia would undergo her own elaborate preparation ritual. She would fast for 3 days, drinking only sacred spring water and eating sacred laurel leaves that may have contained additional psychoactive compounds. She would bathe in the Castalian spring at dawn, dress in special robes, and crown herself with laurel wreaths before entering the sacred chamber beneath the temple. The chamber itself was designed to maximize the psychological and physiological effects of the experience. It was a small underground room lit only by oil lamps, filled with the sweet-smelling ethylene vapors that rose from cracks in the floor. The Pythia would seat herself on a 3-legged bronze tripod positioned directly over the largest fissure, breathing the concentrated gases while entering a state of religious ecstasy. But here's where the story gets really interesting and really disturbing. Many of these prophetic trances weren't brief moments of divine inspiration. They were extended dream-like experiences where the Pythia would remain unconscious for hours, experiencing elaborate visions that she would later interpret as divine commands. And frequently, these drug-induced dreams explicitly called for murder, assassination, and warfare on a massive scale. One of the most famous and tragic cases involved Orestes, the mythical Greek prince whose story was immortalized by playwrights like Aeschylus and became a foundational narrative for Western literature and psychology. According to legend, Orestes consulted the oracle after his father Agamemnon was murdered by his mother Clytemnestra and her lover Aegisthus. The young prince was torn between his duty to avenge his father's death and the absolute, taboo against matricide that governed Greek society. In her drug-induced trance, the Pythia experienced a vivid dream vision where Apollo appeared to her as a golden figure surrounded by blazing light, holding a sword that dripped with blood. The god's presence filled the underground chamber with an overwhelming sense of divine authority that made questioning his commands impossible. Apollo explained that family honor demanded matricide, that Orestes could only restore cosmic balance and cleanse the family bloodline by spilling his own mother's blood. The vision wasn't brief or abstract. The Pythia experienced an elaborate divine lecture about the nature of justice, honor, and family obligation. Apollo showed her detailed images of the crimes Clytemnestra had committed, not just the murder of Agamemnon, but spiritual pollution that threatened the entire cosmic order. The god explained that allowing matricide to go unpunished would corrupt the fundamental principles that held civilization together. Apollo also provided specific tactical instructions about how the murder should be carried out. The god showed the Pythia exactly how Orestes should approach his mother, what weapons he should use, and how he should position himself to ensure a quick, clean kill. The divine vision included detailed descriptions of Clytemnestra's daily routines, her vulnerabilities, and the optimal timing for an assassination that would appear to be divinely sanctioned rather than simply criminal. When the Pythia woke from her trance, she immediately delivered Apollo's divine command to Orestes, effectively ordering him to commit one of the most taboo acts in Greek society. The prince was told that his personal feelings about killing his mother were irrelevant. The gods had spoken, and human morality was secondary to divine will. What makes this story particularly chilling is that it wasn't considered unusual or controversial. Greek culture accepted that gods might command mortals to kill their own family members if divine justice required it. The oracle's dream visions were treated as absolute truth, more reliable than human judgment, moral intuition, or social conventions. Matricide became not just acceptable but religiously obligatory when commanded by divine dreams. But the oracle's deadly dreams weren't limited to mythology. Historical records show that real political assassinations were regularly justified by prophetic dreams received at Delphi, and these chemically induced visions shaped the political landscape of the ancient Mediterranean for over a millennium. One well-documented case involved Pausanias, a Spartan general who consulted the oracle before planning the assassination of Persian officials during the Greco-Persian Wars. Pausanias was facing a complex military situation where direct warfare seemed impossible, but targeted killings might destabilize Persian power in the region. He traveled to Delphi seeking divine guidance about whether such assassinations would be morally justified and strategically effective. The Pythia fell into her characteristic ethylene-induced trance and experienced an elaborate dream where Athena appeared, wearing armor stained with Persian blood and carrying a spear that dripped with the gore of foreign enemies. The goddess commanded Pausanias to cleanse the earth of Persian influence through targeted killings, explaining that the Persian presence in Greek territories was a spiritual pollution that offended the gods and threatened the cosmic order. The oracle's dream was remarkably specific and tactically sophisticated. Athena showed her detailed maps of Persian positions, identified specific individuals who needed to be eliminated, and provided tactical advice about how to carry out the assassinations without triggering massive retaliation. The goddess described optimal timing for each killing, suggested methods for avoiding detection, and even provided guidance about how to manipulate local populations to support the assassination campaign. When the Pythia woke and delivered this divine guidance, Pausanias interpreted it as absolute authorization for a series of murders that would destabilize Persian power throughout the region. The dream had transformed political assassination from a morally questionable tactic into a religiously mandated duty that served divine purposes beyond human understanding. What's particularly disturbing about these oracle-inspired killings is how they blended religious authority with political convenience in ways that made any violence seem divinely justified. Military leaders could plan assassination campaigns and then claim they were following divine commands received through the oracle's dreams. Political rivals could be eliminated and their deaths attributed to the will of the gods rather than human ambition or cruelty. The oracle's prophetic dreams also influenced some of the largest military conflicts in ancient history. When city-states were considering whether to go to war, they would often consult Delphi and receive dream-inspired guidance that could commit thousands of soldiers to death in battles that were supposedly ordained by divine will. The Persian wars themselves were partly justified by Delphic prophecies that emerged from the Pythia's drug-induced dreams. When the massive Persian army threatened Greece, various city-states consulted the oracle and received visions of divine support for military resistance that would inevitably involve massive casualties on both sides. The oracle's dreams helped transform what might have been political or economic conflicts into holy wars where killing enemies became a religious duty. One of the most infamous Delphic prophecies involved the Athenian consultation before the Battle of Salamis. The Pythia experienced elaborate dreams where Poseidon showed her vast naval battles, explaining that Greek victory would require sacrifice and bloodshed on an unprecedented scale. The god provided specific tactical advice about naval positioning and strategy, essentially giving the Athenians divine authorization for a military campaign that would result in thousands of deaths. The prophecy that emerged from these dreams was deliberately ambiguous, as many Delphic pronouncements were, but it encouraged the Athenians to pursue a naval strategy that led to one of the most decisive and bloody battles in ancient warfare. Thousands of Persian and Greek sailors died in a conflict that was partly justified by visions experienced by a peasant woman breathing hallucinogenic gases in an underground chamber. What made the Delphic system particularly dangerous was how it institutionalized violence by giving it divine sanction. The oracle's dreams weren't just individual psychological experiences, they became state policy that could justify wars, assassinations, and massacres involving entire populations. The boundary between personal religious experience and public political decision-making was completely eliminated. The oracle also provided divine justification for internal political violence that shaped the development of Greek democracy and philosophy. When political factions were considering whether to eliminate their rivals, they could consult Delphi and receive dream-inspired guidance that either authorized or prohibited specific acts of violence. The oracle's visions became a way of outsourcing moral responsibility to divine authority, allowing politicians to commit atrocities while claiming they were simply following the god's commands. The case of the Osmeionidae, one of Athens' most powerful political families, illustrates how Delphic dream prophecies could justify domestic political violence. When the family was accused of sacrilege and faced potential execution, they consulted the oracle and received visions that commanded their rivals to show mercy. But the same divine dreams also authorized the Alcmene to eliminate their accusers if mercy was refused. These politically motivated consultations created feedback loops of violence where different factions could claim divine authorization for attacking each other. The oracle's drug-induced dreams became weapons in political conflicts, with each side interpreting the Pythia's visions as divine support for their own violent agendas. The theological implications of these oracle-inspired killings were profound and disturbing. Greek religion generally emphasized the importance of avoiding pollution through violence, but the Delphic dreams created exceptions that allowed virtually any murder to be justified as divine service. The oracle's visions could override every moral principle, every social convention, and every legal restriction when the gods supposedly demanded blood. Modern archaeological investigations have revealed the mechanisms behind these deadly divine dreams. The Temple of Apollo was built over geological fissures that released ethylene gas, a substance that produces hallucinations, euphoria, and trance-like states remarkably similar to those described in ancient accounts of the Pythia's experiences. The oracle's divine visions were actually drug-induced hallucinations that ancient Greek society treated as authentic communication from the gods. The ethylene concentration in the underground chamber would have been sufficient to produce elaborate, vivid hallucinations that could last for hours. The Pythia would experience detailed visions that felt more real than ordinary consciousness, complete with visual and auditory elements that created convincing encounters with gods, goddesses, and supernatural beings who provided specific guidance about violence and warfare. The psychological effects of ethylene intoxication explain many features of the Delphic prophecies that seem supernatural to ancient observers. The gas produces feelings of euphoria and divine contact, creates vivid visual and auditory hallucinations, and can generate complex narrative experiences that feel like genuine divine encounters. The Pythia's drug-induced dreams were chemically manufactured religious experiences that ancient society mistook for authentic supernatural communication. But understanding the chemical basis of the oracle's visions makes the historical impact even more disturbing. For over 1,000 years, major political and military decisions throughout the Mediterranean world were influenced by the hallucinations of women breathing hallucinogenic gases in an underground chamber. Wars were fought, assassinations were carried out, and thousands of people died because ancient society treated drug-induced dreams as divine commandments. The Oracle of Delphi operated from roughly the 8th century BC until the 4th century CE, delivering thousands of prophecies that influenced everything from personal decisions to international conflicts. Many of these prophecies involved violence, and many were based on dream visions that the Pythia experienced while intoxicated by naturally occurring hallucinogenic gases. The decline of the oracle began during the Roman period, when increasing skepticism about traditional religion combined with Christian criticism of pagan practices to undermine belief in the Pythia's divine authority. The final recorded prophecy was delivered in 393 CE, when the Emperor Theodosius I ordered the closure of all pagan temples throughout the Roman Empire. But the intellectual and cultural legacy of Delphi continued to influence Western thought long after the oracle fell silent. The concept that divine dreams could justify violence became embedded in Christian theology, Islamic law, and secular political philosophy in ways that continue to shape how societies think about religious authority and moral responsibility. The Oracle of Delphi reminds us that the line between divine inspiration and dangerous delusion has always been thin, and that society's willingness to accept dream commands as legitimate guidance can have absolutely devastating consequences. When hallucinations become holy writ, when drug-induced visions are treated as divine truth, murder becomes not just acceptable but sacred. The most frightening aspect of the Delphic system wasn't that individual people experienced violent dreams, it was that an entire civilization developed institutions that transformed those dreams into political and military policy. The Oracle created a systematic method for converting personal psychological experiences into public violence that could destroy entire cities and reshape the course of history. Sometimes the most dangerous dreams are the ones that society encourages us to follow, especially when religious and political authorities provide institutional support for translating sleeping visions into waking violence. The Oracle of Delphi shows us what happens when dream commands become state policy, and when chemically induced hallucinations are treated as divine wisdom that justifies any atrocity. The ancient Greeks believed they were following the will of the gods, but they were actually following the hallucinations of peasant women breathing toxic gases in underground chambers. The distinction might seem obvious to us, but it was invisible to a civilization that lacked the scientific knowledge to understand the chemical basis of the oracle's visions. Today, the ruins of Delphi attract thousands of tourists who come to see the remains of what was once considered the center of the world. The geological fissures still release small amounts of ethylene gas, though not enough to produce the dramatic effects experienced by the ancient Pythia. The underground chamber where countless deadly dreams were born is now just a tourist attraction, but the questions it raises about dreams, drugs, and divine authority continue to haunt anyone who tries to understand how supernatural beliefs can be weaponized to justify the most terrible acts of violence. Now let's examine one of history's most famous cases of dream commanded violence that was not only accepted but celebrated, Joan of Arc, the peasant girl whose dreams of saints and angels led her to convince the French court to let her wage war against the English during the 100 Years' War. While Joan is usually portrayed as a heroic figure, and in many ways she was, let's be completely honest about what her dreams actually commanded her to do: kill English soldiers, besiege cities, and drive foreign armies from French soil through the most brutal medieval warfare imaginable. Joan of Arc is one of those historical figures who gets sanitized by centuries of romantic storytelling, turned into a symbol of French nationalism and Catholic sainthood that obscures the violent reality of her divine mission. But if we strip away the golden halos and patriotic mythology, what we're left with is a teenage peasant girl who claimed that saints were appearing in her dreams with detailed military briefings, tactical advice, and explicit instructions about how to kill enemy soldiers most efficiently. Born around 1412 in the tiny village of Domremy in what is now northeastern France, Joan grew up during one of the most devastating periods in European history. The 100 Years' War had been raging for nearly 8 decades, turning much of France into a wasteland of burned villages, murdered civilians, and competing armies that lived off the land like locusts. The English controlled most of northern France, including Paris, while various French factions fought each other almost as much as they fought the foreign invaders. Joan's childhood was shaped by constant violence and the ever-present threat of raids by English soldiers or Burgundian allies who would sweep through rural areas, burning crops, stealing livestock, and killing anyone who resisted. She grew up hearing stories of atrocities committed by foreign soldiers, of French villages put to the sword, of women raped and children murdered by armies that treated war as an opportunity for unlimited brutality. But what made Joan different from the thousands of other peasant children who suffered through the Hundred Years' War was that she began experiencing what she claimed were divine visitations when she was about 13 years old. These weren't gentle, comforting religious experiences like you might expect from a pious young girl living through terrible times. Joan's dream visitors were Saint Michael the Archangel, St. Margaret of Antioch, and Saint Catherine of Alexandria, and they came with explicit, detailed instructions about violence and warfare that would make a modern military strategist take notes. The dreams began in 1425, when Joan was working in her father's garden on a summer afternoon. She later described a blinding flash of light, followed by a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, commanding her to pay attention to what she was about to see. In her first vision, Saint Michael appeared as a warrior angel in gleaming armor that seemed to be made of pure light, carrying a sword that burned with divine fire and radiated heat that Joan could feel even in her dream state. Saint Michael's appearance was both beautiful and terrifying. Joan described him as taller than any human, with wings that stretched wider than a church, and eyes that seemed to contain all the righteous fury of heaven itself. When he spoke, his voice was like thunder mixed with the sound of church bells, so powerful that Joan felt the vibrations in her bones. But what he said was even more overwhelming than how he said it. The archangel explained that God had chosen Joan for a specific military mission, to drive the English invaders from French soil and ensure that the Dauphin Charles was crowned as the rightful king of France. But this wasn't going to be accomplished through prayer or negotiation. Saint Michael made it absolutely clear that Joan's divine mission would require her to personally participate in warfare, to lead French soldiers into battle, and to kill English knights and soldiers with her own hands. The saint's instructions were remarkably detailed and tactically sophisticated. Saint Michael would appear with maps that showed English positions throughout northern France, pointing out weaknesses in their defenses and explaining optimal strategies for besieging fortified cities. He would describe the psychological vulnerabilities of English commanders, provide intelligence about their supply lines and reinforcements, and give specific advice about timing attacks to maximize casualties among enemy forces. But the most disturbing aspect of Joan's early visions was how St. Michael taught her to think about violence. The archangel explained that killing English soldiers wasn't just militarily necessary, it was spiritually required. English occupation of French territory was an offense against divine will, and every English soldier who died in battle was actually being freed from the sin of participating in an unjust war. Joan was told that her violence would be an act of mercy that would save enemy souls while serving God's political agenda. Saint Margaret and Saint Catherine soon joined these martial visions, each bringing their own expertise in religious violence. Saint Margaret appeared as a warrior maiden covered in the blood of the dragon she had supposedly slain during her martyrdom, explaining that true Christians must be willing to kill for God when earthly authorities fail to maintain divine order. Saint Catherine manifested as a scholar warrior who could recite complex theological justifications for holy war while demonstrating proper sword techniques and battlefield tactics. The dreams escalated in intensity and specificity over the course of several months. Joan would experience elaborate divine war councils where her three saints would appear together, presenting detailed battle plans that included everything from siege engineering to psychological warfare. They would show her visions of herself leading French armies, wielding weapons with supernatural skill, and personally killing English commanders in single combat that would break enemy morale and inspire French soldiers to greater acts of violence. Joan's saints didn't just command violence, they taught her how to be efficient at it. St. Michael would demonstrate proper sword techniques, showing Joan how to exploit weaknesses in English armor and how to strike for maximum damage with minimum effort. St. Margaret would explain how to use medieval siege weapons, how to position artillery for optimal effect, and how to breach fortified walls that had been designed to withstand conventional attacks. The tactical knowledge that Joan claimed to receive through these dreams was far beyond what a peasant girl should have been able to understand. Her saints provided her with detailed information about metallurgy, military engineering, logistics, and battlefield medicine that suggested either genuine, supernatural guidance or access to military knowledge through channels that historians have never been able to explain. But perhaps most importantly, Joan's divine visions provided her with specific prophecies about her own military success that would prove remarkably accurate. The saints told her exactly which battles she would win, which cities she would capture, and which English commanders she would defeat or kill. They showed her visions of herself lifting the siege of Orleans, capturing strategic fortresses along the Loire River, and clearing a path for the Dauphin's coronation at Reims Cathedral. These prophetic dreams weren't vague or symbolic. They were detailed previews of future military campaigns that included specific dates, locations, and tactical details. Joan claimed that her saints showed her the exact appearance of English commanders she had never seen, described the layout of fortifications she had never visited, and provided intelligence about enemy plans that proved to be accurate when she finally encountered English forces in battle. By early 1429, Joan's dreams had convinced her that she needed to approach the Dauphin Charles and offer her services as a divinely appointed military commander. This was an absolutely audacious plan for a peasant girl with no military experience, no political connections, and no resources beyond her conviction that saints were giving her strategic advice through nocturnal visions. Joan's first challenge was getting anyone to take her seriously. She convinced a local knight named Robert de Baudricourt to provide her with an escort to the Dauphin's court, partly by accurately predicting a French military defeat that occurred exactly when her saints had said it would. When she finally reached the court at Chinon, Joan impressed the Dauphin by recognizing him even though he had disguised himself among his courtiers, a feat she attributed to divine guidance received through her dreams. But the real test came when Joan requested an army and permission to lead it against English forces besieging the city of Orleans. Court officials were understandably skeptical about giving military command to a teenage peasant girl who claimed to receive tactical advice from dead saints. But Joan's detailed knowledge of military affairs and her confident predictions about future victories were compelling enough to convince them to give her a chance. When Joan finally received her army and marched toward Orleans, she proved remarkably effective at translating her dream visions into actual military success. Her tactical knowledge, supposedly delivered through divine dreams, was accurate enough to break a siege that had lasted for months and seemed hopeless to conventional military minds. The siege of Orleans was Joan's first major military test, and the success that followed seemed to validate everything her saints had told her in dreams. Joan approached the siege with supernatural confidence, directing French forces to attack specific positions that she claimed her saints had identified as weak points in English defenses. She personally led charges against fortified positions, wielding weapons with skill that amazed veteran soldiers who had been fighting for decades. But here's what's often overlooked in the romanticized versions of Joan's story. She was personally responsible for the deaths of hundreds, possibly thousands, of English soldiers during her brief military career. Her dream commands weren't just about inspiring French resistance or providing moral leadership. Her saints had given her specific, detailed instructions about how to kill enemy troops most efficiently, and Joan followed those instructions with deadly precision. Joan claimed that Saint Michael had taught her how to use various medieval weapons, from swords and lances to crossbows and primitive firearms. She would often describe exactly how she planned to kill specific English commanders, claiming that her dreams had shown her their deaths in vivid detail before the battles ever took place. Her divine visions weren't just strategic, they were also personal and vengeful in ways that revealed the violent reality beneath the spiritual rhetoric. During the battle for the fortress of Les Tourelles, Joan personally led an assault that resulted in the deaths of hundreds of English defenders. She claimed that her saints had shown her exactly how to approach the fortification, where to position scaling ladders, and how to exploit architectural weaknesses that English engineers had overlooked. The attack succeeded, but the cost in human lives was enormous. Joan's military success continued through a series of victories along the Loire River, where her dream-inspired tactics consistently outmaneuvered English commanders who had been winning battles for decades. She captured Jargeau, Meung-sur-Loire, and Beaugency in rapid succession, each victory adding to her reputation as a divinely guided military genius and increasing the death toll among English forces who couldn't understand how a peasant girl was defeating their experienced commanders. The culmination of Joan's military career came at the Battle of Patay, where her forces surprised and routed a much larger English army, killing over 2,000 enemy soldiers while suffering minimal French casualties. Joan attributed this overwhelming victory to divine guidance received through her dreams, claiming that her saints had shown her exactly when and where to attack for maximum effect. But Joan's dream-commanded violence wasn't limited to battlefield tactics. Her saints also provided her with guidance about psychological warfare, siege engineering, and the systematic destruction of English supply lines that would starve enemy garrisons into submission. Joan's divine visions encompassed every aspect of medieval warfare, from individual combat techniques to strategic planning that could affect entire campaigns. The theological implications of Joan's violent dreams were complex and troubling. Medieval Christian doctrine generally prohibited violence except in very specific circumstances. But Joan's saints provided comprehensive justifications for unlimited warfare against English forces. Her divine visions transformed murder into religious duty, making every dead English soldier a spiritual victory that served God's will. Joan's dreams also included detailed instructions about how to treat prisoners and civilians in occupied territories. Her saints commanded her to show mercy to enemies who surrendered, but they also authorized extreme violence against anyone who continued to resist French forces. The divine guidance Joan received through her dreams created a moral framework that justified both compassion and brutality, depending on tactical circumstances. When Joan was finally captured by Burgundian allies of the English at the siege of Compiègne in May 1430, her military career had lasted only about 14 months. But in that brief period, her dream-commanded violence had changed the course of the 100 Years' War, lifted French morale, and contributed to thousands of deaths on both sides of the conflict. Joan's trial for heresy became a complex examination of the relationship between divine revelation and political violence. English prosecutors argued that her supposed saints were actually demons, and that her dream commands came from Satan rather than God. The distinction mattered enormously in medieval theology. If Joan's dreams came from God, then her violence was justified and holy. If they came from demons, then she was guilty of murder and heresy. The trial proceedings reveal how difficult it was to distinguish between divine and demonic dream commands using medieval theological criteria. Joan's visions contained elements that could be interpreted either way. They promoted Christian values and French political interests, but they also commanded extensive violence and challenged established religious authority by bypassing official hierarchy. Joan maintained until her death that her dreams came from God and that her violence was divinely sanctioned. She was burned at the stake on May 30th, 1431, but 25 years later, her conviction was overturned in a posthumous trial that declared her a martyr. In 1920, nearly 5 centuries after her death, Joan was canonized as a saint by the Catholic Church. This raises profoundly uncomfortable questions about the relationship between religious authority and violence. Joan of Arc is venerated as a saint specifically because her dream commanded violence was successful and served the interests of French nationalism and Catholic orthodoxy. If her dreams had led to defeat rather than victory, if her violence had served English rather than French political goals, she would probably be remembered as a delusional peasant girl who got a lot of people killed. Joan's story demonstrates how society's acceptance of dream commands often depends on political and religious context rather than moral principles. When dream-inspired violence serves the interests of those in power, it becomes divine revelation. When it threatens established authority, it becomes dangerous delusion. The content of the dreams themselves matters less than whether the resulting violence supports or undermines existing power structures. The canonization of Joan of Arc essentially created official Catholic doctrine that dream commanded. Violence can be not only acceptable but holy when it serves appropriate political and religious purposes. This precedent has influenced Christian thinking about warfare and political violence for over 5 centuries, providing theological justification for conflicts ranging from the Crusades to modern religious wars. Joan's military innovations, inspired by her dream visions, also influenced the development of medieval warfare in ways that increased the efficiency and scale of violence. Her tactics were studied and copied by military commanders throughout Europe, spreading the techniques that her saints had allegedly taught her through dreams to armies that had no direct divine guidance. The psychological impact of Joan's success was equally important in normalizing dream-commanded violence. Her victories demonstrated that claims about divine dreams could translate into real military and political power, encouraging other would-be visionaries to seek supernatural guidance for their own violent agendas. Joan's example showed that society would accept and even celebrate dream-inspired violence if it achieved the desired political results. Modern historians continue to debate whether Joan's military knowledge came from genuine divine revelation, from unconscious absorption of information about warfare and politics, or from deliberate coaching by politically motivated advisors who used her religious visions as cover for conventional military planning. The source of her tactical expertise remains mysterious, but the violent consequences of her dream commands are historically documented and undeniable. Joan of Arc's legacy also reveals how religious and political authorities can selectively validate dream commands based on their outcomes rather than their content. The same Catholic Church that burned Joan as a heretic later canonized her as a saint, suggesting that institutional attitudes toward divine dreams depend more on political convenience than theological consistency. The transformation of Joan from condemned heretic to canonized saint demonstrates how dream-commanded violence can be retrospectively legitimized when it serves long-term institutional interests. Her story became a powerful tool for French nationalism and Catholic evangelization, making her violent dreams symbolically valuable regardless of their original divine or demonic origins. Today, Joan of Arc is remembered primarily as a symbol of courage and faith, rather than as a case study in dream-commanded violence. Her military career has been romanticized and sanitized to emphasize her role as a liberator rather than as a killer, obscuring the brutal reality of medieval warfare and the theological complexities of her violent visions. But Joan's story remains relevant to modern discussions about religious violence and the relationship between spiritual authority and political power. Her canonization establishes official precedent that dream-commanded violence can be not only morally acceptable but spiritually praiseworthy when it serves appropriate religious and political purposes. The sword that Joan carried into battle, which she claimed was discovered through divine guidance received in dreams, was never found after her capture. But the questions her case raises about the relationship between divine revelation and human violence continue to influence religious and political thought in ways that make her story far more complex and troubling than the simplified heroic narratives typically associated with her legacy. Joan of Arc reminds us that even the most celebrated cases of dream-commanded violence raise profound questions about how we distinguish between divine guidance and dangerous fantasy, and how political and religious institutions shape our understanding of when supernatural dreams justify earthly bloodshed. When saints become military advisors and divine visions become battle plans, the line between heaven and hell becomes difficult to discern through the smoke of medieval warfare. Our final main story takes us to one of the darkest chapters in human history, the Holocaust, and examines how Heinrich Himmler, one of Nazi Germany's most powerful leaders, used claims about prophetic dreams to justify genocide and mass murder on an industrial scale. This isn't just a story about political evil or bureaucratic efficiency. It's about how one man's nocturnal visions became the theological foundation for systematic murder that would ultimately claim over 6 million lives. Heinrich Himmler wasn't just a bureaucrat of death. He was deeply obsessed with occultism, ancient Germanic mythology, and what he believed were prophetic visions that came to him in dreams. These nocturnal revelations became part of the ideological foundation for some of history's most systematic and horrific acts of violence, transforming personal psychological fantasies into state policy that would reshape the map of Europe and redefine the boundaries of human evil. Born in 1900 in Munich to a middle-class Catholic family, Himmler seemed destined for an unremarkable life as a schoolteacher or minor civil servant. His father was a strict disciplinarian who emphasized duty, order, and traditional German values, while his mother was a devout Catholic who raised her children to respect authority and follow established social conventions. Nothing in young Heinrich's background suggested that he would become one of history's most notorious mass murderers. But even as a child, Himmler showed signs of the obsessive personality traits that would later make him such an efficient organizer of genocide. He kept detailed diaries documenting every aspect of his daily life, maintained meticulous records of his academic performance, and displayed an unusual fascination with ancient history and mythology that would eventually evolve into dangerous delusions about racial superiority and supernatural destiny. Himmler's transformation from unremarkable middle-class student to architect of genocide began during World War I, when he was too young to serve in combat but old enough to absorb the nationalist mythology that blamed Germany's defeat on internal enemies and foreign conspiracies. Like many young Germans of his generation, Himmler became convinced that his country had been betrayed by Jews, communists, and other groups that had supposedly stabbed the German army in the back. After the war, Himmler drifted through various right-wing political movements before joining the Nazi Party in 1923, drawn by Hitler's promises to restore German greatness and eliminate the internal enemies who had allegedly caused the country's humiliation. But what made Himmler different from other Nazi activists was his growing obsession with occultism and his belief that political action needed to be guided by supernatural forces that could reveal the true destiny of the German people. From his early days in the Nazi Party, Himmler claimed to experience recurring dreams where ancient Germanic gods would appear to him as spiritual guides offering wisdom about Germany's future role in world history. These weren't ordinary political fantasies or nationalist daydreams. They were elaborate theological visions where figures like Wotan, Thor, and other Norse deities would engage Himmler in complex discussions about race, destiny, and the cosmic purpose of the German people. The dreams typically followed a consistent pattern that became more elaborate and specific over time. Himmler would find himself in ancient Germanic forests, surrounded by towering oak trees that seemed to pulse with spiritual energy. The air would be filled with mist that carried the voices of long-dead ancestors, and gradually the gods themselves would materialize from the fog, appearing as massive figures dressed in ancient armor and carrying weapons that seemed to burn with supernatural fire. Wotan, the chief god of the Germanic pantheon, usually appeared first, manifesting as a one-eyed warrior king, whose presence filled the entire forest with an overwhelming sense of ancient power and divine authority. When Wotan spoke, his voice seemed to come from the earth itself, resonating through Himmler's body like the sound of distant thunder. The god would explain that the German people were descendants of a divine race that had been chosen to rule the world. But first they needed to purify the earth by eliminating inferior races that polluted the spiritual environment. These weren't brief, abstract conversations. Himmler's dreams were elaborate theological seminars where ancient Germanic gods would provide detailed lectures about racial theory, genetic science, and the spiritual necessity of genocide. Wotan would explain that Jews, Roma, disabled individuals, and other groups weren't just politically or economically problematic, they were spiritual pollutants that prevented the Germanic people from achieving their divine destiny as the master race. The dreams became increasingly specific about the mechanisms of racial purification that would be required to fulfill Germanic destiny. Thor would appear as a divine engineer, showing Himmler detailed visions of how to organize mass deportations, design concentration camps, and manage the logistics of industrial killing. The god would explain that certain peoples could be sent to sleep permanently as a mercy, sparing them the pain of continued existence in a world where they didn't belong. What made these dreams particularly dangerous was how they provided comprehensive implementation strategies for genocide that went far beyond simple hatred or political convenience. Himmler's divine visions weren't just commanding mass murder, they were showing him efficient methods for organizing the systematic elimination of entire populations. The gods would appear with organizational charts, logistical plans, and technical specifications for death camps that could process thousands of victims per day. One particularly detailed dream that Himmler recorded in his personal diary involved Wotan appearing in a vast underground chamber filled with sleeping figures arranged in perfect rows. The god explained that certain races could be sent to eternal sleep through the use of special chambers filled with gas that would allow them to die peacefully without pain or fear. When Himmler woke from this dream, he immediately began planning the construction of extermination facilities that would use poison gas to kill victims efficiently and quietly. The theological framework that emerged from Himmler's dreams was sophisticated and internally consistent, providing supernatural justification for every aspect of Nazi genocide policy. The ancient Germanic gods would explain that eliminating inferior races wasn't murder but cosmic housekeeping, a necessary step in preparing the world for the golden age when pure, Germanic blood would create a perfect society guided by divine wisdom. Himmler would often describe these dreams to his subordinates in the SS, using them to justify increasingly extreme policies and overcome any moral reservations that officers might have about participating in mass murder. When SS commanders expressed doubts about killing civilians, Himmler would explain that their hesitation was understandable, but that higher powers had revealed the necessity of their actions through divine dreams that transcended human moral categories. The most chilling aspect of Himmler's dream justifications was how they transformed genocide into religious duty, making mass murder seem not only acceptable but spiritually necessary. He genuinely believed that his dreams represented communications from ancient Germanic deities who were commanding him to cleanse the world for spiritual reasons that went beyond political or racial considerations. Murder became a sacred obligation, and the more people he killed, the more he believed he was serving divine will. Himmler's personal diaries, discovered after the war, reveal that he experienced these prophetic dreams throughout the Holocaust, often recording detailed descriptions of conversations with ancient gods, followed by specific policy recommendations for accelerating the pace of mass murder. The dreams provided both theological justification and practical guidance for implementing genocide on an unprecedented scale. In one diary entry from October 1942, Himmler described a particularly elaborate dream where he met with the spirit of an ancient Germanic warrior king who showed him visions of a purified Europe populated only by racially pure Germans. The warrior explained that this vision could only be achieved through the complete elimination of Jewish and Slavic populations, and provided specific advice about how to organize the killing process more efficiently while maintaining secrecy from the German civilian population. The dream warrior also addressed practical concerns about disposing of bodies, managing transportation logistics, and maintaining the morale of SS personnel involved in mass killing. Himmler's nocturnal visions had essentially become comprehensive management seminars for organizing genocide, complete with quality control measures and performance optimization strategies. What made Himmler's case particularly disturbing was how his dream justifications were accepted and amplified by the Nazi hierarchy, creating a feedback loop of supernatural authorization for genocide. Other Nazi leaders began reporting similar prophetic dreams that reinforced Himmler's visions, suggesting either shared psychological delusions or deliberate collaboration in creating mythological justifications for mass murder. Heinrich Müller, the head of the Gestapo, claimed to receive dreams where ancient Germanic gods commanded him to eliminate political enemies and resistance fighters. Reinhard Heydrich reported visions of divine warriors instructing him to organize mass deportations and establish ghettos that would concentrate Jewish populations for easier elimination. Hans Frank, the governor of occupied Poland, described dreams where Wotan personally commanded him to reduce the Polish population through starvation and execution. This proliferation of genocidal dreams among Nazi leadership created an institutional culture where mass murder was not only politically expedient but spiritually mandated. The Holocaust wasn't just a practical solution to the Jewish question, it was a religious crusade, guided by divine revelation received through the sleeping minds of Nazi officials who believed they were following orders from supernatural authority. Hitler himself occasionally referenced dreams and visions in his speeches, though he was generally more focused on political and racial arguments than mystical justifications. But Himmler's dream mythology became an important part of Nazi ideology, especially within the SS, where officers were encouraged to view their participation in mass murder as spiritual service to ancient Germanic gods who were guiding the creation of a new world order. The SS training programs that Himmler developed included extensive indoctrination in Germanic, mythology and occult practices designed to prepare officers for receiving their own divine dreams and visions. SS soldiers were taught meditation techniques, exposed to ancient Germanic religious texts, and encouraged to seek supernatural guidance for their military and political activities. The goal was to create an entire organization of true believers who would view genocide as religious duty rather than criminal activity. Himmler also established special research institutes dedicated to studying ancient Germanic religion and developing modern applications of pre-Christian spiritual practices. The Ernennerb, or Ancestral Heritage Organization, sent expeditions around the world to collect artifacts and knowledge that could support Nazi racial theories and provide historical precedent for contemporary genocide policies. These research projects were partly motivated by Himmler's dreams, which often included specific instructions about historical investigations that could validate the supernatural guidance he was receiving. Ancient Germanic gods would appear in his visions with detailed information about archaeological sites, historical documents, and cultural practices that could provide evidence for Nazi, racial theories, and divine authorization for genocide. The Ernennerb expeditions to Tibet, the Middle East, and other regions were essentially attempts to find physical evidence that would support Himmler's dream visions about Germanic racial superiority and divine destiny. The organization spent enormous resources trying to prove that ancient Germanic peoples had once ruled vast empires and that their descendants were destined to reclaim global dominance through racial purification. Himmler's dreams also influenced the design and operation of concentration camps, which were constructed according to specifications that he claimed came from divine visions about efficient methods for processing large numbers of victims. The layout of major extermination facilities like Auschwitz-Birkenau reflected organizational principles that Himmler attributed to supernatural guidance received through his sleeping communications with ancient Germanic gods. The gas chambers themselves were designed according to specifications that Himmler claimed came from dreams where Watton showed him underground chambers filled with sleeping figures who died peacefully without pain or fear. The industrial killing apparatus of the Holocaust was essentially built according to blueprints that emerged from one man's nocturnal fantasies about divine authorization for mass murder. Himmler's dream justifications also influenced Nazi policies toward disabled individuals, Roma populations, Soviet prisoners of war, and other groups that were targeted for elimination during the Holocaust. Each expansion of genocide was justified through reference to new divine dreams, where ancient Germanic gods explained why additional populations needed to be eliminated to achieve racial purification. The T4 euthanasia program, which killed over 70,000 disabled individuals, was explicitly justified by Himmler through reference to dreams where Germanic gods explained that genetic defects were spiritual pollutants that needed to be eliminated to maintain racial purity. The systematic murder of disabled people became a rehearsal for larger genocide programs, using techniques and personnel that would later be deployed in extermination camps. The treatment of Soviet prisoners of war, millions of whom were deliberately starved or murdered in Nazi custody, was also influenced by Himmler's dreams about Slavic peoples as racially inferior populations that needed to be eliminated to make room for Germanic settlement in Eastern Europe. His nocturnal visions provided theological justification for violating international law and treating captured soldiers as subhuman enemies who could be killed without moral consequence. Perhaps most disturbing was how Himmler's dreams evolved to include detailed instructions about concealing evidence of genocide and preparing for the possibility of German defeat. As the war turned against Nazi Germany, Himmler's divine visions began focusing on methods for destroying records, eliminating witnesses, and ensuring that the scope of Holocaust crimes would never be fully documented or understood. In late 1944, Himmler recorded dreams where ancient Germanic gods instructed him to accelerate the pace of killing while simultaneously destroying evidence of extermination facilities. The gods allegedly explained that even if Germany lost the war, the racial purification work needed to continue, and the methods developed during the Holocaust would eventually be used again when Germanic peoples reclaimed their divine destiny. These final dreams revealed the ultimate horror of Himmler's supernatural justifications, the belief that genocide was not just a wartime expedient but a permanent, religious obligation that would continue indefinitely until racial purification was complete. His visions had created a theological framework that could justify endless cycles of mass murder, making the Holocaust just the beginning of an eternal crusade against racial enemies. When Nazi Germany collapsed in May 1945, Himmler attempted to escape capture by disguising himself as a common soldier, but he was identified by British forces and arrested on May 23, 1945, rather than face trial for war crimes. Himmler bit down on a cyanide capsule hidden in his mouth and died within minutes, taking his secrets about genocidal dreams to the grave. Himmler's personal papers, discovered after his death, revealed the extent to which his policies had been influenced by what he believed were divine dream commands. His diaries contained hundreds of detailed descriptions of conversations with ancient Germanic gods, often followed by specific policy recommendations for accelerating mass murder and improving the efficiency of extermination facilities. The documents also revealed that Himmler had been planning post-war genocide programs based on his continuing divine dreams, including detailed schemes for eliminating entire populations in occupied territories and establishing Germanic settlements on land cleared through systematic murder. His supernatural visions had encompassed not just the immediate Holocaust but long-term plans for continental-scale ethnic cleansing that would have continued for decades. Modern historians continue to debate whether Himmler's dream justifications represented genuine psychological delusion or calculated propaganda, designed to motivate his subordinates and provide ideological cover for practical genocide policies. The consistency and detail of his supernatural narrative suggest either severe mental illness or remarkable creativity in developing mythological frameworks for mass murder. Some scholars argue that Himmler's occult interests and dream visions were sincere expressions of his psychological need to find supernatural justification for actions that he couldn't accept as purely criminal or political. The elaborate theological framework he developed around Germanic mythology may have been his mind's way of avoiding direct confrontation with the moral implications of genocide. Other historians contend that Himmler's supernatural claims were deliberate fabrications designed to manipulate subordinates, who were more likely to participate in mass murder if they believed it was divinely commanded rather than simply politically expedient. The dream narratives may have been sophisticated propaganda tools rather than genuine religious experiences. But regardless of whether Himmler's dreams were authentic or fabricated, their historical impact was undeniably real and catastrophic. The theological framework he developed around Germanic mythology became institutional doctrine within the SS and influenced how thousands of Nazi officials understood their participation in genocide. His supernatural justifications helped transform ordinary men into mass murderers who believed they were serving divine rather than human authority. The Himmler case represents perhaps the most extreme example of how dream justifications can be used to rationalize unspeakable evil, demonstrating how personal visions can be transformed into institutional ideologies that justify systematic violence on an unprecedented scale. When individual fantasies become organizational doctrine, when personal dreams become state policy, the results can destroy entire civilizations and redefine the boundaries of human evil. Himmler's dreams didn't cause the Holocaust. Nazi genocide was driven by complex political, economic, social, and psychological factors that would have operated regardless of his supernatural beliefs. But his mystical justifications helped create a psychological framework that made mass murder seem not only acceptable but spiritually necessary, transforming criminal conspiracy into religious crusade. This transformation reveals one of the most dangerous aspects of dream commanded violence, its ability to provide comprehensive worldviews that justify unlimited brutality while relieving perpetrators of moral responsibility. When dreams become ideologies, when sleeping visions are treated as divine commandments, ordinary moral categories become irrelevant, and the most terrible acts can be committed with clear conscience. The ruins of Himmler's extermination camps remain as monuments to the ultimate consequences of treating dream commands as divine revelation, while his personal papers provide chilling documentation of how supernatural beliefs can be weaponized to justify the most systematic and efficient mass murder in human history. His legacy reminds us that the most dangerous people in history are often those who convince themselves that their crimes are actually divine service, and that the most evil acts are frequently committed by individuals who believe they are following higher moral authority rather than simple human hatred. When dreams become theology, when sleeping visions are treated as sacred scripture, when personal fantasies are transformed into institutional doctrine, the results can justify any atrocity and rationalize any level of violence. Himmler's supernatural dreams became the foundation for industrial genocide, proving that sometimes the most dangerous revelations are the ones that tell us exactly what we want to hear while providing divine authorization for our darkest impulses. The question that haunts anyone who studies Himmler's case is whether his genocidal dreams represented genuine psychological delusion or calculated ideological manipulation, and whether the distinction actually matters when the practical consequences include the systematic murder of millions of innocent people. Perhaps the most terrifying aspect of his story is how it demonstrates that evil can be efficiently organized and theologically justified regardless of whether the underlying supernatural beliefs are authentic or fabricated. Today, Himmler's personal effects and documents are preserved in archives around the world, studied by historians trying to understand how one man's claimed divine dreams became the foundation for history's most systematic genocide. His SS uniform, his personal diary, and his collection of occult artifacts serve as reminders that the line between religious faith and dangerous delusion can become fatally blurred when supernatural authority is used to justify unlimited violence against vulnerable populations. The gas chambers that Himmler claimed were designed according to divine specifications have been preserved as memorials to the victims of the Holocaust, while the theological framework he developed around Germanic mythology continues to influence extremist movements that seek supernatural justification for contemporary racial violence. His legacy serves as a permanent warning about how dream commands can be weaponized to transform personal, psychological dysfunction into institutional evil that reshapes the course of human history. In the early hours of May 23, 1987, Kenneth Parks drove 23 kilometers to his in-laws' house in the Toronto suburb of Scarborough, beat his father-in-law Dennis Woods with a tire iron, and stabbed his mother-in-law Barbara Ann Woods to death with a kitchen knife. When he was arrested 3 hours later, covered in blood and with his hands severely injured from gripping the knife so tightly that he had cut through his own tendons, Parks claimed he had no memory of the events because he had been sleepwalking the entire time. The case seemed absolutely impossible from every angle you could examine it. How could someone drive for 23 kilometers through city streets, navigate to a specific address in an unfamiliar neighborhood, locate weapons, and commit brutal murder while completely unconscious? How could the human brain coordinate such complex, goal-directed behavior without any conscious awareness or memory formation? And most importantly, how could anyone believe such an obviously fabricated defense story? But Kenneth Parks wasn't just some random criminal trying to escape responsibility for a brutal double murder. He was a 23-year-old married man with an infant daughter, working as an electronics salesman and struggling with gambling, debts that had gotten him into serious trouble with his employer and his family. More importantly, he actually liked his in-laws. Dennis and Barbara Ann Woods had been supportive and understanding about his financial problems, and Parks had been planning to meet with them the next day to discuss his gambling addiction and ask for their help in getting his life back on track. The complete absence of motive made Parks' case particularly puzzling for investigators and prosecutors. Most murder cases involve obvious motives like money, jealousy, revenge, or personal conflicts that escalate into violence. But Parks had no reason to want his in-laws dead. Quite the opposite. since they represented his best hope for emotional and financial support during one of the most difficult periods of his life. Kenneth Parks had been struggling with severe insomnia and stress-related sleep disorders for months before the murder, partly due to his mounting gambling debts and partly due to pressures at work, where his supervisor had discovered his financial problems and was threatening to fire him. He had been taking sleeping pills irregularly, sometimes combining them with alcohol, and his sleep patterns had become increasingly chaotic and unpredictable. For weeks before the murder, Parks had been experiencing what sleep specialists would later identify as complex parasomnia episodes, elaborate, sleepwalking behaviors that went far beyond the simple wandering typically associated with ordinary somnambulism. Parks would sometimes wake up to find that he had gotten dressed, prepared meals, or rearranged furniture while apparently unconscious, with no memory of these activities and no awareness that anything unusual had happened. His wife, Melanie, had become increasingly concerned about these episodes, particularly when she would wake up to find Kenneth standing beside their bed, staring at her with a blank expression that seemed to indicate he was unconscious despite having his eyes open. When she would speak to him during these episodes, he would sometimes respond appropriately but would have no memory of the conversations when he woke up the next morning. The sleepwalking episodes had been escalating in complexity and duration over the course of several months. Parks would sometimes spend hours engaged in elaborate activities while apparently unconscious, performing household tasks, watching television, or even having conversations with family members that he couldn't remember the next day. His behavior during these episodes was generally purposeful and goal-directed, though sometimes his actions were inappropriate or bizarre. On the night of May 22, 1987, Parks fell asleep on the couch in his living room while watching Saturday Night Live, still wearing the clothes he had worn to work that day. His wife had gone to bed earlier, and their infant daughter was sleeping in her crib. Parks later testified that he remembered nothing from the time he fell asleep until he woke up standing in the lobby of the nearest police station, covered in blood and confused about how he had gotten there. According to the reconstruction developed by sleep specialists and forensic investigators, Parks entered a state of complex somnambulism sometime between 1 o'clock and 1:30 a.m. while unconscious. He got up from the couch, found his car keys, left his house, got into his car, and drove 23 kilometers through Toronto to his in-laws' home in Scarborough, a journey that required navigating multiple traffic lights, stop signs, and highway on-ramps while apparently completely unconscious. The drive itself was remarkable evidence for the reality of Parks' sleepwalking defense. Security cameras and witness accounts confirmed that he had driven normally and obeyed traffic laws throughout the journey, suggesting that his motor cortex and spatial navigation systems were functioning normally even though his consciousness and memory formation were completely suppressed. His unconscious brain had somehow retained enough information about his in-laws, address, and the route to their house to navigate there successfully while asleep. When Parks arrived at the Woods house, he used his key to enter through the front door. Dennis and Barbara Ann had given him a key because they trusted him and wanted him to feel welcome in their home at any time. Parks later testified that he had never used the key before and wasn't even sure he remembered having it, but his unconscious mind had apparently retained the information and accessed it during his sleepwalking episode. What happened next was reconstructed through forensic evidence, blood spatter analysis, and the testimony of Dennis Woods, who survived the attack despite suffering severe injuries. Parks apparently went to the kitchen and armed himself with a knife and a tire iron that he found in the garage. He then went upstairs to the master bedroom, where his in-laws were sleeping, and began attacking them without warning or apparent provocation. The attack was brutal and sustained, suggesting that Parks' unconscious mind was capable of coordinated, goal-directed violence even while his conscious awareness was completely suppressed. Barbara Ann Woods was stabbed multiple times and died from her injuries, while Dennis Woods was beaten with the tire iron and suffered severe head trauma, but managed to survive by pretending to be dead until Parks left the house. Dennis Woods later testified that Parks' behavior during the attack was strange and mechanical, as if he was operating on autopilot without normal emotional responses or awareness of his actions. Parks' facial expression was blank and emotionless throughout the assault. and he didn't respond to Dennis' attempts to communicate with him or plead for mercy. The attack seemed driven by some unconscious compulsion rather than anger, hatred, or any other recognizable human emotion. After the murders, Parks apparently drove to the nearest police station and walked into the lobby, where he was found by officers who were initially confused about whether he was a victim or a perpetrator. Parks was covered in blood, his hands were severely injured from gripping the knife so tightly that he had severed tendons in his own fingers, and he appeared disoriented and confused about where he was and what had happened. The police officers who first encountered Parks noted that his behavior was consistent with someone emerging from a dissociative state rather than someone trying to fabricate an alibi. He seemed genuinely confused about his injuries, surprised to find blood on his clothing, and unable to explain how he had gotten to the police station. His responses to questioning were inconsistent with someone who was lying or trying to construct a false narrative. Parks' defense team faced the enormous challenge of convincing a jury that their client had committed brutal murder while completely unconscious, a claim that seemed to violate common sense and basic assumptions about how the human mind works. They assembled a team of sleep specialists, neurologists, and forensic psychologists who had to explain complex scientific concepts about consciousness, memory formation, and automatic behavior to jurors who had no background in neuroscience or sleep medicine. The medical evidence supporting Parks' sleepwalking defense was actually quite compelling once experts had the opportunity to present it properly. Brain scans showed unusual patterns of activity that were consistent with severe sleep disorders, and Parks' family history included multiple relatives with documented cases of complex somnambulism, including an uncle who had once driven several miles while unconscious and a cousin who regularly performed elaborate household tasks while asleep. Dr. Roger Broughton, one of Canada's leading sleep specialists, testified that Parks suffered from a severe form of parasomnia that could indeed allow him to perform complex, coordinated actions while completely unconscious. The condition was rare but well documented in medical literature, and the specific circumstances of Parks' case were consistent with documented examples of violent behavior during sleepwalking episodes. The expert testimony revealed that sleepwalking is far more complex and potentially dangerous than most people realize. During deep sleep stages, the motor cortex can remain active while the prefrontal cortex, the brain region responsible for conscious awareness, moral reasoning, and memory formation, is completely suppressed. This creates a dissociated state where people can perform elaborate behaviors without any conscious control or later memory of their actions. Complex sleepwalking episodes can last for hours and include behaviors like driving vehicles, preparing meals, engaging in sexual activity, and even committing acts of violence. The key diagnostic criteria include automatic behavior, amnesia for the episode, and the absence of conscious intent or awareness during the actions. People in these states can respond to environmental stimuli and perform goal-directed behaviors while remaining completely unconscious. The prosecution argued that Parks' story was an elaborate fabrication designed to avoid responsibility for premeditated murder, pointing to the complex nature of his actions and the apparent purposefulness of his behavior as evidence that he must have been conscious and aware during the attacks. They contended that nobody could drive 23 kilometers, locate weapons, and commit coordinated violence while genuinely unconscious. But the defense successfully demonstrated that Parks' behavior was actually consistent with documented cases of complex parasomnia, and that his actions during the episode showed characteristics that distinguished unconscious automatic behavior from conscious, deliberate action. Parks had not attempted to conceal evidence, had not tried to establish an alibi, and had voluntarily presented himself to police immediately after the attack's behavior. That was inconsistent with premeditated murder, but consistent with someone emerging from a dissociated state. The most compelling evidence for Parks' innocence was his immediate self-presentation to police and his apparent confusion about his injuries and location. Someone who had consciously committed murder would presumably have attempted to clean up evidence, dispose of weapons, and create some kind of cover story. Instead, Parks had driven directly to the police station, while still covered in blood and with weapons potentially still in his possession. The jury's decision to acquit Parks of murder was based on their acceptance of expert testimony that he had been genuinely unconscious during the attacks and therefore could not be held criminally responsible for actions he didn't consciously control. The verdict established an important legal precedent that unconscious actions during genuine sleep states could not be considered criminal behavior, regardless of how violent or destructive the results might be. But the case also raised disturbing questions about the relationship between dreams and violence that went beyond the legal issues of criminal responsibility. Parks had been experiencing recurring dreams about violence and aggression for weeks before the murder, and sleep specialists noted that his unconscious actions seemed to follow patterns that had been established in his dream content. During his psychological evaluation, Parks revealed that he had been having increasingly vivid and disturbing dreams about attacking people with weapons, dreams that he found troubling but had dismissed as stress-related fantasies with no connection to real-world behavior. The content of these dreams was remarkably similar to the actions he performed while sleepwalking, suggesting that his unconscious mind had been rehearsing violence during REM sleep and then acting out those rehearsals during deep sleep episodes. The possibility that Parks' dreams had somehow programmed his sleepwalking behavior raised unsettling questions about the relationship between dream content and unconscious action. If people can rehearse violent scenarios during REM sleep and then act them out during parasomnia episodes, the boundary between sleeping fantasy and waking reality becomes much more permeable and dangerous than most people realize. Sleep specialists who studied Parks' case noted that violent sleepwalking episodes often involve the acting out of aggressive dream content, suggesting that there may be neural pathways that allow dream narratives to influence unconscious motor behavior. This means that people who experience violent dreams might be at risk for acting out those dreams during complex sleepwalking episodes, even if they have no conscious intention or desire to commit violence. The Parks case became a landmark in both sleep medicine and criminal law, establishing legal precedents for the sleepwalking defense while raising scientific questions about the relationship between consciousness, dreams, and automatic behavior. Kenneth Parks was released from custody and returned to his family, but he required ongoing medical treatment for his sleep disorder and psychological counseling to help him cope with the trauma of having killed someone he loved while unconscious. The case also had profound implications for understanding how dreams might influence violent behavior in ways that bypass conscious moral reasoning and legal responsibility. If our sleeping minds can rehearse violence through dreams and then act out those rehearsals through unconscious motor behavior, the relationship between dream content and real-world action becomes much more complex and potentially dangerous than conventional wisdom suggests. Parks' story reminds us that the boundary between sleeping and waking consciousness is not as clear or secure as we might assume, and that the violence we experience in dreams might sometimes find expression through unconscious actions that can have devastating real-world consequences. When dreams become rehearsals for violence, and when unconscious minds act out those rehearsals without conscious awareness or control, the results can destroy lives and families in ways that traditional concepts of criminal responsibility are inadequate to address. The Parks case established that unconscious violence during genuine sleepwalking episodes cannot be considered criminal behavior, but it also revealed how little we understand about the relationship between content and automatic motor behavior. When our sleeping minds rehearse violence night after night, we might be training ourselves to commit acts of brutality that our conscious minds would never approve, and we might have no memory or awareness of crossing that line from dream to reality. In 1692, the Salem witch trials reached their peak of madness, and at the center of the hysteria were teenage girls who claimed that witches were commanding them to commit murder through shared dreams that felt more real than their waking lives. These spectral evidence cases show how collective dream narratives can spiral into mass violence when an entire community becomes convinced that supernatural forces are using sleep as a battlefield for cosmic war between good and evil. The trouble began in the frigid winter of 1691 to 1692, when Reverend Samuel Parris's 9-year-old daughter Elizabeth and 11-year-old niece Abigail Williams started experiencing what they described as afflictions, seizures. strange behaviors, and claims that they were being tormented by witches who appeared in their dreams with increasingly specific and terrifying commands. But these weren't ordinary nightmares about monsters or falling off cliffs. The girls claimed that accused witches were appearing in their sleep as spectral figures, teaching them forbidden knowledge and commanding them to kill other villagers through methods that seemed to come from supernatural instruction manuals. Salem Village in 1692 was a community under enormous stress, torn apart by property disputes, religious conflicts, and economic tensions that had been building for decades. The Puritan settlers lived in constant fear of Indian attacks, struggled with harsh winters and failed crops, and maintained a rigid religious culture that saw the hand of God or Satan in every aspect of daily life. It was a perfect environment for collective hysteria, but what made the Salem outbreak particularly dangerous was how it centered on shared dreams that seemed to provide detailed instructions for supernatural warfare. The girls' initial complaints were relatively minor. They claimed to feel pinching sensations, see strange visions, and experience fits of shaking that their parents and local ministers interpreted as signs of supernatural attack. But as the winter progressed, their symptoms became more elaborate and their accusations more specific. Elizabeth and Abigail began describing detailed, nocturnal encounters with women from their community who appeared in their dreams as witches, complete with specific instructions about how to harm neighbors and family members. The dream commands were remarkably sophisticated and coordinated between the two girls, suggesting either genuine shared psychological experiences or deliberate collaboration in creating supernatural narratives. Elizabeth would describe elaborate nocturnal meetings where accused witches like Tituba, Sarah Good, and Sarah Osborne would appear as spectral figures, teaching the girls how to prepare poisons from common household materials, how to curse livestock so they would sicken and die, and how to murder sleeping victims without leaving physical evidence that could be detected by authorities. What made these dream accusations particularly dangerous was their specificity and apparent supernatural knowledge. The girls claimed that witches were teaching them information they couldn't have known through normal means, the personal secrets of community members, the locations of hidden objects, and detailed knowledge about herbal poisons and curse techniques that seemed beyond what children could invent on their own. Abigail Williams became particularly vocal about receiving murder instructions through her dreams, claiming that various accused witches would appear to her as spectral teachers who provided detailed lessons in supernatural violence. She described dreams where Sarah Good would demonstrate how to cause fatal accidents that would appear natural, where Bridget Bishop would explain methods for causing sudden illnesses that would kill victims within days, and where Martha Corey would provide tactical advice about eliminating multiple targets without arousing suspicion. These dream instructions weren't abstract or symbolic. They were practical training sessions where accused witches allegedly taught the girls specific techniques for committing murder through supernatural means. The spectral figures would explain how to focus malevolent energy on particular individuals, how to use sympathetic magic to cause harm at a distance, and how to coordinate attacks with other witches to maximize the effectiveness of their supernatural violence. As word of the girls' afflictions spread throughout Salem Village, other young women began reporting similar experiences, creating a feedback loop of shared supernatural narratives that reinforced and expanded the original accusations. And Putnam Jr., Mercy Lewis, Mary Walcott, and Elizabeth Hubbard all claimed to be receiving similar dream commands from the same accused witches, describing coordinated nocturnal meetings where groups of spectral figures would plan community-wide violence. The dream narratives became increasingly elaborate and detailed as more accusers joined the hysteria. The girls described vast supernatural conspiracies where accused witches would meet in spectral form to plan the destruction of Salem's Puritan community, with specific individuals assigned to eliminate particular targets through supernatural means. These dream meetings allegedly included detailed discussions of strategy, timing, and methods for avoiding detection by religious authorities. What made the Salem case particularly terrifying was that the court system accepted spectral evidence testimony about what people had seen in dreams or visions as valid proof of witchcraft and conspiracy to commit murder. If someone claimed that an accused witch had appeared in their dreams commanding violence, that dream testimony could be used to convict the accused person of supernatural conspiracy and sentence them to death by hanging. The girls' dream narratives became the primary evidence in most of the witch trials, with their descriptions of spectral encounters treated as eyewitness testimony about supernatural crimes. The accusers would describe in vivid detail how accused witches appeared in their dreams, what specific murder instructions they provided, and how these dream commands were coordinated with other supernatural conspirators to threaten the entire community. Judge William Stoughton, who presided over most of the witch trials, was particularly receptive to spectral evidence and treated the girls' dream testimonies as reliable proof of supernatural conspiracy. The court accepted that witches could appear in spectral form to innocent victims, that these spectral appearances constituted genuine criminal activity, and that dream testimony was sufficient evidence to justify execution. As the trials progressed, the dream accusations became more elaborate and began targeting increasingly prominent community members. The girls claimed that their spectral tormentors included not only marginal figures like Tituba and Sarah Good, but also respected church members, successful merchants, and even ministers' wives who were allegedly leading double lives as supernatural conspirators. The accusers described dreams where these respected community members would appear as witches, explaining that their public piety was merely a disguise that concealed their true allegiance to Satan and their participation in supernatural murder plots. The dream narratives revealed a hidden world where Salem's most trusted residents were actually enemy agents working to destroy Puritan society from within. Martha Corey, a church member known for her piety and skepticism about the witch trials, became a target when the girls claimed. She appeared in their dreams as a particularly dangerous witch who specialized in teaching murder techniques to younger supernatural conspirators. The accusers described elaborate dream sessions where Corey would explain how to use her reputation for religious devotion to avoid suspicion while carrying out supernatural attacks against community members. Rebecca Nurse, an elderly and respected member of Salem Village, was accused based on dream testimony that she appeared as a spectral figure commanding the girls to murder their own family members. The accusers claimed that Nurse's spectral form was particularly insidious because it would appear as a kindly grandmother figure while delivering the most horrific instructions about killing children and elderly relatives through supernatural means. The dream accusations against prominent community members created a climate of terror where nobody felt safe from supernatural charges. If respected church members could be revealed as witches through dream testimony, then anyone could be accused and executed based on the nocturnal visions of teenage girls who claimed to be receiving murder instructions from spectral enemies. The most disturbing aspect of the Salem trials was how the dream accusations created their own reality through the legal process. People who were accused based on dream testimony often confessed to witchcraft, either because they genuinely believed they might be guilty of unconscious supernatural crimes or because confession offered the only chance of avoiding execution. These confessions, extracted under enormous psychological pressure, often included detailed admissions of supernatural conspiracy that seemed to confirm the accuser's dream narratives. The confessing witches would describe attending spectral meetings, receiving instructions from Satan, and participating in supernatural plots to destroy Salem's Puritan community, admissions that were then used as evidence to support additional accusations and executions. Tituba, Reverend Parris's slave, who was among the first people accused, provided a particularly detailed confession that seemed to validate the girls' dream testimonies about supernatural conspiracy. Under interrogation, she described attending spectral meetings with other witches, receiving books from Satan that contained instructions for supernatural violence, and participating in coordinated attacks against community members. Her confession included specific details about supernatural murder techniques that matched the dream instructions described by the accusers, creating a feedback loop where confessions and accusations reinforced each other to create an increasingly elaborate mythology of supernatural conspiracy. The legal process itself became a mechanism for generating evidence that seemed to confirm the reality of the dream commands that had started the entire hysteria. By the summer of 1692, the witch trials had become a systematic process for converting dream accusations into legal executions. Bridget Bishop was hanged on June 10th, becoming the first victim of a legal system that treated teenage dreams as criminal evidence. She was followed by Sarah Good, Elizabeth Howe, Susanna Martin, and Sarah Wilds on July 19th, then George Burroughs, Martha Carrier, John Willard, George Jacobs Sr., and John Proctor on August 19th. Each execution was justified partly or entirely by spectral evidence, testimony about dream encounters where the condemned individuals had allegedly appeared as supernatural conspirators providing murder instructions to teenage accusers. The gallows on Salem's Proctor's Ledge became a monument to the power of shared dreams to create legal reality, as 20 people were executed based largely on nocturnal visions that a Puritan community accepted as evidence of supernatural crime. The trials finally ended in October 1692, when Governor William Phipps disbanded the Court of Oyer and Terminer and prohibited the use of spectral evidence in legal proceedings. The decision came partly because prominent community members, including the governor's own wife, had begun to be accused based on dream testimony, making it clear that the accusations could target anyone regardless of their social status or religious standing. Modern historians believe that the Salem accusations were driven by a complex combination of social tensions, economic conflicts, psychological stress, and possibly ergot poisoning from contaminated grain that could have caused hallucinations and shared psychological symptoms. But regardless of the underlying causes, the case demonstrates how collective delusions about dream commands can lead to mass violence when legal and religious authorities provide institutional support for treating nocturnal visions as evidence of criminal conspiracy. The Salem witch trials became a cautionary tale about the dangers of accepting dream testimony as legal evidence, but they also revealed how shared, supernatural narratives can create their own reality through social and institutional processes. When dreams become evidence, when sleeping visions are treated as eyewitness testimony, when nocturnal accusations are given the same legal weight as physical proof, the results can justify executing anyone who becomes the target of collective paranoia. The teenage girls whose dream accusations started the Salem hysteria were never held accountable for their role in 20 executions, and most went on to live normal lives in communities that gradually forgot about their participation in one of American history's most shameful episodes of mass violence. Their shared dreams of spectral witches commanding murder had created a legal reality that destroyed families and traumatized an entire community, but the accusers themselves suffered no consequences for their nocturnal narratives. The case files from the Salem witch trials, preserved in Massachusetts archives, contain hundreds of pages of dream testimony that was accepted as legal evidence of supernatural conspiracy and murder. These documents provide a chilling record of how collective delusions about dream commands can be institutionalized through legal processes, transforming shared fantasies into official reality that justifies state-sanctioned violence against vulnerable community members. Salem's legacy reminds us that the most dangerous dream commands are often the ones that provide institutional validation for existing social tensions and conflicts. When dreams become weapons in community disputes, when nocturnal visions are treated as evidence in legal proceedings, when sleeping accusations are given the power to destroy lives and families, the boundary between fantasy and reality dissolves in ways that can justify unlimited violence against anyone unlucky enough to become the target of collective nightmares. When dreams become evidence and spectral accusations carry the same legal weight as physical proof, entire communities can descend into madness that treats nightmares as criminal testimony and executes people based on the sleeping visions of teenagers who claim to be receiving murder instructions from supernatural enemies. Salem shows us what happens when society loses the ability to distinguish between dreams and reality, between nocturnal fantasy and criminal evidence, between shared psychological experiences and genuine supernatural conspiracy. Charles Manson's cult didn't just commit random murders. They claimed their violence was inspired by prophetic dreams that revealed a coming race war called Helter Skelter a cosmic conflict that would ultimately destroy civilization and leave Manson's followers as the survivors who would inherit the Earth. These shared dream narratives became the ideological foundation for some of the most notorious murders in American history, demonstrating how charismatic leaders can weaponize collective dreaming to transform personal delusions into group violence that seems to serve a larger apocalyptic purpose. Charles Manson wasn't just a criminal mastermind or a psychopathic killer. He was a master manipulator who understood how to exploit the power of dreams and drug-induced visions to create a shared mythology that could justify unlimited violence. His ability to combine LSD-fueled hallucinations with biblical prophecy and racial paranoia created a belief system that transformed his followers from confused young people into dedicated killers who genuinely believed they were participating in divine revelation rather than criminal conspiracy. Born in 1934 to an unmarried teenage mother, Manson spent most of his childhood and adolescence in reform schools, foster homes, and juvenile detention facilities where he developed the psychological skills that would later make him such an effective cult leader. He learned how to read people's vulnerabilities, how to exploit their need for belonging and meaning, and how to create alternative reality systems that could override conventional moral reasoning. By the late 1960s, when Manson began gathering his followers in the Haight-Ashbury district of San Francisco, American society was experiencing unprecedented cultural upheaval. The Vietnam War, civil rights movement, counterculture revolution, and widespread experimentation with psychedelic drugs had created an environment where traditional authorities were questioned and alternative spiritual systems seemed both necessary and possible. Manson positioned himself as a prophet who could provide answers to the confusion and alienation that many young people were experiencing. He claimed to receive revelations through dreams and drug-induced visions that revealed the true nature of reality and the approaching end of the current world order. His followers, most of whom were young women from middle-class backgrounds who were seeking meaning and community, became convinced that Manson possessed genuine supernatural insight. The helter-skelter prophecy that would ultimately motivate the Manson murders emerged from a complex combination of biblical interpretation, racial paranoia, and drug-induced hallucinations that Manson claimed came to him through prophetic dreams. He convinced his followers that he was receiving direct communication from divine forces that were revealing the imminent collapse of American society and the birth of a new world order that would be ruled by spiritually enlightened survivors. Manson's prophetic dreams were remarkably detailed and specific, incorporating elements from the Book of Revelation, contemporary racial tensions, and popular music that he interpreted as coded messages about the coming apocalypse. He claimed that the Beatles' White Album contained hidden prophecies about racial war, with songs like Helter Skelter and Blackbird serving as divine communications about the violent transformation that would destroy existing civilization. The dream prophecies that Manson shared with his followers described a three-phase apocalyptic process that would begin with strategic murders, designed to trigger racial conflict between African Americans and white Americans. According to Manson's visions, these initial killings would be blamed on black militants, sparking a race war that would escalate into complete social breakdown and the collapse of government authority. In the second phase of Manson's prophetic scenario, African Americans would win the racial war and eliminate most of the white population, but they would prove incapable of governing the complex technological society they had inherited. This would create an opportunity for the third phase, when Manson and his followers would emerge from hidden refuges to rule over the remaining population as spiritual leaders of a purified world. What made Manson's dream prophecies particularly effective was how he shared them with his followers through group sessions where LSD and other psychedelic drugs created collective hallucinatory experiences that seemed to validate his visions. The cult members would experience shared revelations during these drug sessions, seeing the same apocalyptic scenarios that Manson described and feeling like direct participants in divine communication rather than passive listeners to one man's delusions. These collective drug experiences created a feedback loop where individual hallucinations reinforced group beliefs, making Manson's prophecies seem like objective spiritual reality rather than personal psychological projections. The followers would emerge from these sessions convinced that they had personally witnessed divine revelations about the coming racial war and their own destiny as survivors of the apocalypse. Susan Atkins, one of Manson's most devoted followers, later testified about the elaborate shared visions that the group experienced during LSD sessions at their commune in Death Valley. She described seeing detailed scenes of urban warfare, burning cities, and racial violence that matched Manson's prophetic descriptions exactly. These weren't individual drug trips, but coordinated group experiences where multiple people claimed to see the same apocalyptic scenarios simultaneously. Patricia Krenwinkel, another core member of the Manson family, reported similar experiences during group drug sessions where she claimed to see visions of herself and other followers living in a post-apocalyptic world where they served as spiritual guides for the survivors of racial war. These shared hallucinations created a sense of collective destiny that made the group's eventual violence seem like the fulfillment of divine prophecy rather than criminal activity. The most dangerous aspect of Manson's dream-based ideology was how it provided specific tactical guidance for triggering the prophesied racial war. His visions weren't just abstract prophecies about future events, they included detailed instructions about how to manipulate racial tensions through strategic violence that would be designed to appear racially motivated while actually serving the cult's apocalyptic agenda. Manson claimed that his prophetic dreams showed him exactly how to stage murders that would be blamed on African American militants, sparking the racial conflict that would ultimately lead to his followers' ascension to power. The dreams allegedly provided specific guidance about victim selection, crime scene staging, and methods for ensuring that the murders would be interpreted as racially motivated attacks rather than random criminal violence. The most famous result of these dream commands was the brutal murder of Sharon Tate and 4 others at 10,050 Cielo Drive in Benedict Canyon on August 9, 1969. Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Linda Kasabian carried out this attack under the direction of Charles Tex Watson, following a plan that Manson claimed had been revealed to him through prophetic dreams about triggering racial apocalypse. The Tate murders were designed according to Manson's dream instructions to appear racially motivated, with the killers leaving behind messages written in the victims' blood that were intended to implicate African American militants. The word pig was written on the front door in Sharon Tate's blood, while Helter Skelter was written on the refrigerator in Lino LaBianca's blood the following night, directly referencing the prophetic scenario that Manson claimed to have received through divine dreams. The LaBianca murders on August 10, 1969, followed the same pattern, with Watson, Atkins, and Krenwinkel killing Lino and Rosemary LaBianca while staging the crime scene to appear racially motivated. The killers carved war into Lino LaBianca's stomach and wrote "Death to Pigs" and "Rise" on the walls in the victim's blood, following specific instructions that Manson claimed came from his prophetic visions about triggering racial conflict. During their trials, several Manson family members testified about the dreams and shared visions that had motivated their participation in the murders. They described elaborate group hallucinations where Manson appeared as a Christ-like figure leading them through apocalyptic scenarios that required strategic violence to fulfill divine will and bring about the prophesied transformation of human society. Susan Atkins testified that she genuinely believed the murders were necessary to trigger the racial war that would ultimately lead to a better world, ruled by spiritually enlightened people like herself and her fellow cult members. She described participating in group drug sessions, where she experienced visions of the post-apocalyptic society that would emerge after the prophesied violence, making her feel like she was working toward a positive transformation rather than simply committing murder. Patricia Krenwinkel provided similar testimony about shared dreams and visions that convinced her that the murders were part of a divine plan to destroy a corrupt society and replace it with a spiritual community guided by Manson's prophetic insights. She claimed that her participation in the killings felt like religious service rather than criminal activity, because she believed she was helping to fulfill prophecies that had been revealed through collective supernatural experiences. The Manson case demonstrates how charismatic leaders can use claims about prophetic dreams to manipulate followers into committing violence that serves the leader's personal agenda, while convincing the perpetrators that they are participating in divine revelation. When individual dreams become collective mythology, when drug-induced hallucinations are treated as supernatural communication, when shared delusions are validated through group experiences, the results can justify the most horrific acts as necessary steps toward spiritual transformation. But perhaps most disturbing about the Manson murders is how the cult's dream prophecies contained just enough cultural resonance to seem plausible to people who were struggling to understand the social upheaval of the late 1960s, the racial tensions, anti-war protests, and generational conflicts that were reshaping American society provided a realistic foundation for apocalyptic fantasies that might have seemed completely delusional in a more stable social environment. Manson's ability to weave together biblical prophecy, contemporary politics, popular culture, and drug-induced visions created a belief system that felt both spiritually meaningful and tactically relevant to followers who were seeking ways to understand and influence the chaotic world around them. His dream prophecies provided both cosmic purpose and practical guidance for people who felt alienated from conventional society and desperate for alternative meaning systems. The prosecution in the Manson trial focused heavily on demonstrating that the defendants' claims about prophetic dreams and divine revelation were simply elaborate justifications for premeditated murder motivated by Manson's desire for attention and control. They argued that the religious rhetoric was a manipulation tactic designed to exploit vulnerable followers rather than genuine spiritual experience. But the defense testimony revealed that many of the Manson family members genuinely believed in the prophetic dreams and shared visions that had motivated their crimes, suggesting that the boundary between manipulation and delusion is often unclear in cases involving charismatic leaders and collective supernatural experiences. The followers' sincere belief in their divine mission made them more dangerous rather than less culpable, because their conviction justified unlimited violence in service of apocalyptic goals. Charles Manson was convicted of conspiracy to commit murder and sentenced to death, though his sentence was later commuted to life imprisonment when California temporarily abolished capital punishment. He remained in prison until his death in 2017, continuing to claim that his prophetic dreams had revealed divine truth about racial conflict and social transformation that society was too spiritually blind to understand. The other Manson family members involved in the murders received similar sentences and remained in prison for decades, with most continuing to express belief in the prophetic visions that had motivated their crimes. Their cases became studies in how collective delusions about divine dreams can create shared reality systems that justify violence while providing psychological protection against guilt and moral responsibility. The Manson murders became a cultural touchstone that marked the end of the idealistic phase of the 1960s counterculture movement, demonstrating how alternative spirituality and drug experimentation could be weaponized by manipulative leaders to justify shocking violence. The case showed that the search for meaning and transcendence could be exploited to create destructive cult dynamics that transformed spiritual seeking into criminal conspiracy. Modern cult experts study the Manson case as an example of how prophetic dreams and shared visions can be used to create closed belief systems that justify unlimited violence, while providing followers with a sense of cosmic purpose and spiritual superiority. The case demonstrates that the most dangerous cults are often those that combine genuine spiritual experiences with apocalyptic ideology and charismatic leadership that can transform personal psychological needs into collective criminal activity. The helter-skelter prophecy that motivated the Manson murders shows how dream commands can be scaled up from individual psychological experiences to group ideologies that justify systematic violence in service of larger spiritual or political goals. When prophetic dreams become shared mythology, when drug-induced visions are treated as divine revelation, when collective delusions are validated through group experiences, The results can create terrorist organizations that believe they are serving divine rather than human purposes. The legacy of the Manson murders continues to influence how law enforcement and mental health professionals understand the relationship between alternative spirituality and violent extremism, demonstrating that the most dangerous religious movements are often those that combine genuine transcendent experiences with apocalyptic beliefs and manipulative leadership that can transform spiritual seeking into criminal violence that seems cosmically justified to the perpetrators. Today, the Manson case serves as a warning about how prophetic dreams and shared visions can be weaponized by charismatic leaders to create closed belief systems that justify unlimited violence, while providing followers with alternative meaning systems that override conventional moral reasoning. When dreams become ideology and visions become battle plans, the results can create terrorist cells that believe they are serving divine purposes, while committing the most shocking crimes in service of apocalyptic fantasies that feel more real than ordinary social reality. In 2004, Dina Schlosser cut off her infant daughter's arms with a kitchen knife while singing hymns, claiming that God had commanded her in a dream to offer her child as a sacrifice that would demonstrate perfect faith and secure her family's eternal salvation. The case shocked Texas and raised profoundly troubling questions about religious delusion, maternal violence, and the thin line between divine revelation and dangerous mental illness that can transform the most fundamental human bonds into justifications for unspeakable tragedy. Dina Schlosser was not a monster when her story began. She was a 35-year-old mother of 3 daughters, married to John Schlosser, a software engineer who worked long hours to support their family in their suburban home in Plano, Texas. Dina was a deeply religious woman who had converted to Christianity as an adult and threw herself into Bible study, church attendance, and prayer with the intensity of someone seeking absolute certainty in a world that often felt chaotic and meaningless. But Dina was also struggling with severe postpartum depression following the birth of her youngest daughter, Margaret, in November 2003. The condition, which affects roughly 10 to 15% of new mothers, had transformed Dina's personality in ways that her family and friends found increasingly alarming. She had become withdrawn, obsessive about religious practices, and prone to making statements about spiritual warfare and divine testing that seemed to go far beyond normal Christian faith. For months before the attack, Dina had been experiencing what she described as increasingly intense religious visions and direct communications from God that came to her primarily through dreams. These weren't comforting spiritual experiences or gentle guidance about parenting and faith. They were elaborate biblical dialogues where angels and divine figures would engage her in complex theological discussions about sacrifice, faith, and maternal duty that felt more real and urgent than her everyday life as a suburban mother. The dreams typically followed a disturbing pattern that escalated over several months. Dina would find herself in biblical landscapes, sometimes the Garden of Eden, sometimes Mount Moriah, where Abraham nearly sacrificed Isaac, sometimes standing before the altar of Solomon's temple. In these dreams, she would encounter angels who appeared as towering figures of light, their presence so overwhelming that she would feel physically weak and spiritually transformed. The angels would engage Dina in elaborate theological discussions about the nature of perfect faith and absolute obedience to divine will. They would explain that God was preparing to test her faith in the same way he had tested Abraham, showing her that true believers must be willing to sacrifice even their most precious possessions when commanded by divine authority. But unlike the biblical story of Abraham and Isaac, Dina's dreams never included divine intervention or last-minute reprieve. The angels would explain that her test would be different, more complete, requiring her to follow through with the sacrifice to demonstrate perfect faith that went beyond even Abraham's obedience. They would show her visions of her daughter Margaret as a sacrifice that would secure eternal salvation, not just for the child, but for Dina's entire family. The theological framework that emerged from these dreams was sophisticated and internally consistent, drawing on legitimate Christian doctrines about sacrifice, faith, and divine testing while twisting them into justifications for infanticide. The angels would cite specific Bible verses, reference complex theological concepts, and provide detailed explanations of how child sacrifice could serve God's purposes in ways that human minds couldn't fully comprehend. As Dina's postpartum depression deepened, the boundary between her dreams and waking consciousness began to dissolve. She would find herself thinking about her angelic conversations during the day, checking Bible verses to confirm the theological arguments she had heard while sleeping, and gradually becoming convinced that her dreams represented genuine divine communication rather than symptoms of mental illness. Dina's family and friends noticed that she was becoming increasingly obsessed with biblical stories about sacrifice, particularly the account of Abraham and Isaac, which she would reference constantly in conversations about faith and obedience. She began talking about the need for absolute surrender to God's will, regardless of how painful or incomprehensible divine commands might seem to human understanding. The religious community around Dina was ill-equipped to recognize that her increasingly intense spiritual experiences were actually manifestations of severe postpartum psychosis complicated by religious delusion. When she discussed her dreams with fellow church members, they interpreted her visions as signs of deep faith rather than dangerous mental illness, inadvertently reinforcing her belief that she was receiving authentic divine revelation. John Schlosser later testified that his wife had tried to discuss her dreams with him, but he had been working long hours and hadn't fully grasped the severity of her psychological condition. When Dina talked about feeling called to make sacrifices for God, he assumed she was referring to lifestyle changes or increased charitable giving, not literal child sacrifice based on angelic commands received through dreams. The dreams became more specific and urgent in the weeks leading up to the attack. Dina would experience elaborate divine ceremonies where angels would explain exactly how the sacrifice should be performed, what prayers should be recited, and how the act would demonstrate perfect obedience to divine will. The visions included detailed instructions about timing, location, and methods that would ensure the sacrifice was performed according to divine specifications. On November 22, 2004, while John was at work and her two older daughters were at school, Dina believed she received the final divine command to perform the sacrifice that had been building in her dreams for months. She placed her 11-month-old daughter Margaret on her bed, used a kitchen knife to sever both of the infant's arms, and then called 911 to report what she had done. When police arrived at the Schlosser home, they found Dina sitting calmly beside her mutilated daughter, covered in blood but showing no emotion about what she had done. She immediately explained that she had followed God's instructions to offer her child as a sacrifice, claiming that the act would save her family's souls and demonstrate perfect faith that would be rewarded in heaven. Margaret Schlosser died from blood loss before paramedics could save her, but Dina showed no grief or remorse about her daughter's death. She maintained that she had performed a sacred duty that required her to overcome maternal instincts in order to serve divine purposes that transcended human understanding. During her arrest and initial questioning, Dina provided detailed descriptions of the angelic dreams that had commanded her to sacrifice her daughter. She could recall specific theological arguments, biblical references, and divine instructions with remarkable precision, suggesting that her religious delusions were elaborate and internally consistent rather than random psychological symptoms. The trial that followed became a complex examination of the relationship between religious faith and mental illness, forcing the legal system to distinguish between legitimate spiritual experiences and dangerous psychotic delusions. Dina's defense team argued that she was legally insane at the time of the murder, driven by postpartum psychosis and religious hallucinations that made her unable to understand the nature of her actions. Psychiatric experts who examined Dina found clear evidence of severe postpartum psychosis, complicated by religious delusion, including command hallucinations, grandiose religious beliefs, and complete inability to distinguish between divine revelation and psychological symptoms. Her dreams about angelic commands weren't isolated incidents, but part of a broader pattern of psychotic symptoms that had been building since Margaret's birth. The prosecution initially sought the death penalty, arguing that Dina's actions were premeditated and that her religious claims were simply attempts to avoid responsibility for murdering her own child. They contended that anyone capable of planning and executing such a deliberate act must have understood that it was wrong, regardless of their religious beliefs. But the medical evidence supporting Dina's insanity defense was compelling. Brain scans showed abnormalities consistent with severe postpartum depression. Her family history included relatives with documented mental illness, and her behavior following the murder was consistent with someone experiencing genuine psychotic delusion rather than calculated criminal planning. In 2006, Dina Schlosser was found not guilty by reason of insanity and committed to a state mental hospital for treatment of her ongoing mental illness. The verdict recognized that her actions, while horrific, were the result of severe psychological symptoms that had made her unable to distinguish between religious revelation and dangerous delusion. The case raised difficult questions about the relationship between religious faith and mental health treatment that continue to challenge both legal and medical professionals. Dina's delusions were deeply rooted in biblical narratives that are central to Christian faith, making it challenging to address her mental illness without appearing to attack legitimate religious beliefs. Like many cases of religiously motivated violence, Dina's story demonstrates how mental illness can distort spiritual teachings into justifications for horrible acts, and how the line between divine revelation and dangerous delusion can become fatally blurred when psychological symptoms are interpreted through religious frameworks. The theological content of Dina's delusions also made them particularly resistant to treatment, because her visions were rooted in legitimate Christian doctrines that couldn't be challenged without undermining her entire belief system. Mental health professionals had to find ways to treat her psychotic symptoms while respecting her religious convictions, a balance that required unprecedented sensitivity and expertise. Dina's case became another tragic example of how dream commanded violence can exploit the deepest human relationships and the most sacred spiritual beliefs, transforming maternal love and religious faith into justifications for unspeakable tragedy. When dreams become indistinguishable from divine revelation, when sleeping visions override every moral boundary and parental instinct, the results can destroy the most fundamental bonds that hold families and communities together. Today, Dina Schlosser remains in a Texas mental health facility, where she receives ongoing treatment for her psychological condition, while serving an indefinite commitment that will continue until medical professionals determine that she no longer poses a danger to herself or others. Her case continues to influence how the legal system handles defendants who claim religious justification for violent crimes, and how mental health professionals approach the treatment of postpartum psychosis complicated by religious delusion. The kitchen knife that Dina used to kill her daughter was destroyed as evidence, but the questions her case raised about dreams, delusion, and divine command continue to haunt anyone who tries to understand how the most sacred human bonds can be severed by sleeping visions that feel more real than waking life. As we slow down and reflect on these disturbing stories, it's important to understand that the relationship between dreams and violence has been a source of fascination and terror throughout human history. Different cultures have developed vastly different approaches to understanding when dreams might command violence, and when such commands should be obeyed or resisted, creating complex systems of belief that have shaped how societies handle supernatural claims about divine authorization for murder. Throughout most of human history, dreams were considered a legitimate source of divine commands, including instructions to commit violence, but ancient cultures developed sophisticated systems for distinguishing between dreams that came from gods and those that came from demons or evil spirits. The assumption was always that some dreams represented genuine supernatural communication, but determining which dreams were authentic required careful evaluation by trained religious authorities. In ancient Mesopotamia, dream interpretation was a professional occupation that required years of training and access to elaborate textual traditions that catalog different types of violent visions and their meanings. Babylonian and Assyrian priests would study comprehensive dream manuals that described hundreds of different scenarios involving supernatural commands for violence, providing detailed guidance about how to distinguish between divine authorization and demonic deception. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of humanity's oldest literary works, includes several episodes where gods communicate through dreams that command or authorize violence against specific individuals or groups. These divine dream commands were considered morally binding on the recipients, but only if they could be verified through proper religious channels and confirmed by multiple independent sources. The Code of Hammurabi, one of the world's oldest legal systems, included specific provisions for crimes committed based on dream commands that claimed divine authorization. If someone killed another person while claiming divine dream instruction, the case would be referred to temple priests who would conduct elaborate investigations to determine whether the dreams were genuinely divine or merely personal delusion. These investigations involved examining the dreamer's character and religious standing, analyzing the content of the dreams for consistency with established theological doctrine, and looking for confirmatory signs that might indicate genuine divine communication. Only dreams that passed all these tests could be accepted as legitimate justification for violence, creating quality control mechanisms that protected communities from false prophets and delusional individuals. Egyptian dream interpretation was even more sophisticated, with different gods associated with different types of violent dreams and elaborate procedures for distinguishing between beneficial and harmful supernatural communications. Dreams of killing enemies were generally associated with Horus and considered blessed omens, while dreams of domestic violence were linked to Set and viewed as spiritual pollution that required immediate ritual purification. Egyptian medical papyri describe specific treatments for people who experienced violent dreams, including herbal remedies, ritual cleansings, and protective amulets that could shield dreamers from malevolent supernatural influences. The Egyptians understood that not all violent dreams came from gods. Some were caused by demons, illness, or psychological disturbance that required medical rather than religious intervention. The Edwin Smith Papyrus and Ebers Papyrus, two of the most important ancient medical texts, include detailed discussions of how to distinguish between dreams that indicated divine communication and those that suggested mental illness or supernatural attack. Egyptian physicians were trained to recognize the difference between religious visions and pathological symptoms, providing early examples of systematic approaches to evaluating supernatural claims. Greek culture produced some of the most complex thinking about dream violence in the ancient world, with philosophers like Aristotle and Plato developing theoretical frameworks for understanding how dreams might convey divine information, while also recognizing the potential for psychological delusion and supernatural deception. Aristotle's On Dreams argued that violent dreams could represent either divine commands or psychological disturbance, and that determining the difference required careful analysis of the dreamer's character, circumstances, and the specific content of their visions. He developed criteria for evaluating supernatural claims that emphasize consistency, moral coherence, and practical outcomes as tests of divine authenticity. The Greek concept of divine madness, the idea that gods could temporarily possess mortals and command them to commit violence, became a central theme in their literature, philosophy, and legal system. Greek courts would sometimes acquit defendants who claimed divine possession, but only if their actions served larger purposes that the community could recognize as beneficial and their claims could be verified by religious authorities. Greek tragedies like those of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides regularly explored the moral complexities of divine dream commands that required characters to commit violence against family members or community leaders. These dramatic works served as community discussions about how to balance respect for divine authority with protection of social order and individual moral responsibility. Roman law took a more skeptical approach to dream commands, generally requiring physical evidence to support claims of divine instruction and limiting the circumstances under which supernatural communications could justify criminal behavior. However, Roman culture still accepted that certain types of dreams could represent genuine divine communication, especially when they involved state security or military matters. The Roman concept of religio emphasized the importance of maintaining proper relationships with divine forces through established ritual procedures, creating institutional frameworks for evaluating supernatural claims that balanced respect for divine authority with protection against fraud and delusion. Roman priests developed elaborate protocols for testing prophetic dreams and visions, including requirements for multiple witnesses and confirmatory signs. What's particularly interesting about ancient legal systems is how they tried to develop objective criteria for evaluating subjective experiences, creating systematic approaches to distinguishing between authentic divine communication and personal psychological problems. Most cultures required that dream commands be consistent with established religious doctrine, serve community interests, and be verified by religious authorities before they could be used to justify violence. These ancient approaches reveal a more nuanced understanding of dream psychology than our modern legal system often demonstrates. Rather than simply dismissing all dream commands as mental illness or accepting them uncritically as divine revelation, ancient cultures tried to distinguish between different types of supernatural communication and different levels of personal responsibility for actions inspired by dreams. During the medieval period, Christian theology developed elaborate frameworks for understanding dream violence that still influence how we think about these cases today, creating comprehensive systems for distinguishing between dreams sent by God, dreams sent by Satan, and dreams that originated from purely human psychological causes. Thomas Aquinas and other scholastic philosophers argued that God could indeed command violence through dreams, but only under very specific circumstances that served divine justice and promoted the greater good of Christian society. They developed detailed criteria for recognizing authentic divine dreams, including consistency with Scripture, promotion of spiritual good, and confirmation through multiple independent sources. Medieval canon law included specific procedures for evaluating claims of divine dream commands that combine theological analysis with practical investigation of the dreamer's circumstances and character. Church authorities would examine the content of dreams for theological consistency, investigate the dreamer's moral standing and religious knowledge, and look for miraculous confirmations that might indicate genuine divine communication. The most famous medieval case of dream-commanded violence was obviously Joan of Arc, whose visions were subjected to extensive theological examination during her trial for heresy. The transcript of her trial reveals the sophisticated methods that medieval authorities used to evaluate supernatural claims, including detailed questioning about the appearance of her dream visitors, the consistency of their messages, and the theological implications of their commands. Medieval theologians developed complex theories about how to distinguish between divine and demonic dream communications, recognizing that Satan could send false dreams that appeared to be divine commands but actually served evil purposes. The concept of demonic deception was central to medieval psychology, and church authorities developed elaborate tests for identifying supernatural communications that came from malevolent rather than benevolent sources. The Malleus Maleficarum and other medieval texts on witchcraft and supernatural phenomena included detailed discussions of how demons could manipulate human dreams to encourage violence and social disruption. These works provided guidelines for recognizing demonic influence and protecting communities from individuals who might be receiving false divine commands through supernatural deception. Medieval medical texts, heavily influenced by Arabic scholarship and classical Greek philosophy, also recognized that certain types of violent dreams could result from physical illness rather than supernatural communication. Physicians would examine dreamers for signs of mental disturbance, humoral imbalances, or poisoning that might explain their violent visions without invoking supernatural causes. The medieval synthesis of theology, medicine, and law created comprehensive frameworks for understanding dream violence that acknowledged both supernatural and natural causes, while providing institutional mechanisms for distinguishing between different types of cases. This approach was more sophisticated than either purely religious or purely medical explanations, recognizing that different cases might require different types of analysis and intervention. Medieval culture's acceptance of divine dream commands helped justify both individual acts of violence and larger military campaigns, with the Crusades being partly motivated by claims of divine dreams and visions received by religious leaders. Many medieval wars were fought by commanders who claimed to be following supernatural instructions received through sleep, creating precedents for using dream commands to justify large-scale violence. But medieval authorities also recognized the danger of false claims about divine dreams, developing strict penalties for people who fabricated supernatural justifications for violence or used religious rhetoric to cover criminal activity. The medieval approach tried to balance respect for genuine divine communication with protection against fraudulent or delusional claims that could destabilize social order. The development of medieval Inquisition procedures included sophisticated methods for evaluating supernatural claims and distinguishing between authentic religious experiences and various forms of deception or delusion. Inquisitors were trained to recognize the psychological and theological characteristics of genuine divine communication, providing early examples of systematic approaches to evaluating claims about religious visions and dreams. Medieval universities developed academic disciplines dedicated to studying supernatural phenomena and developing theoretical frameworks for understanding how divine communication worked in practice. These scholarly traditions created intellectual foundations for distinguishing between different types of spiritual experiences and evaluating their moral and legal implications for individual and community behavior. The development of modern psychiatry and neuroscience has fundamentally changed how legal systems approach cases of dream-commanded violence, shifting focus from theological questions about the source of dreams to medical assessment of the dreamer's psychological state and capacity for moral reasoning. This transformation represents one of the most significant changes in how human societies understand the relationship between supernatural beliefs and criminal responsibility. The legal concept of insanity has evolved significantly since the 19th century, when courts began recognizing that mental illness could impair a person's ability to understand the nature of their actions or distinguish between right and wrong. This shift moved the focus from theological evaluation of dreams to medical assessment of psychological competence, fundamentally changing how legal systems handle defendants who claim divine authorization for violent behavior. The Manhattan Rule, established in 1843 following a famous case in England, created the first systematic legal framework for evaluating criminal responsibility in cases involving mental illness and delusion. This rule emphasized the defendant's ability to understand the nature of their actions and distinguish right from wrong, providing objective criteria that could be applied, regardless of the specific religious or supernatural content of their beliefs. Modern forensic psychiatry recognizes several specific conditions that can cause violent dreams and sleep-related violence, including various forms of psychosis, severe depression with psychotic features, dissociative disorders, and specific sleep disorders like REM sleep behavior disorder and complex sleepwalking. These medical categories provide systematic frameworks for understanding dream-commanded violence that focus on neurological and psychological mechanisms rather than theological questions. The legal system's approach to dream-commanded violence now typically involves detailed psychiatric evaluation to determine whether the defendant was experiencing genuine mental illness at the time of the crime, with courts looking for evidence of impaired reality testing, consistent patterns of delusion, and other indicators of psychological disturbance that might affect criminal responsibility. However, modern legal systems still struggle with the question of how to handle defendants who claim religious justification for their actions, particularly when their beliefs are rooted in mainstream religious traditions. Courts must balance respect for religious freedom with protection of public safety, often leading to complex decisions about when religious beliefs become pathological delusions that justify reduced criminal responsibility. The neuroscience of dreaming has revealed fascinating insights into why some people might experience violent dream commands that feel more real than waking experiences. Research shows that certain brain conditions can cause dreams to feel more vivid and compelling than normal consciousness, and that some individuals have difficulty distinguishing between dream memories and actual events. Modern sleep medicine has identified specific disorders that can cause people to act out their dreams violently, including REM sleep behavior disorder, which can cause people to physically enact their dream experiences, sometimes resulting in serious injury to themselves or their bed partners. These discoveries have provided medical explanations for some cases that might previously have been attributed to supernatural causes. But perhaps most importantly, modern research has shown that the vast majority of people who experience violent dreams never commit actual violence, suggesting that dream content alone is not sufficient to explain criminal behavior. This finding indicates that other factors, including mental illness, social stress, and personal history, play crucial roles in determining whether dreams translate into action. The modern approach to dream-commanded violence emphasizes individual psychological assessment rather than categorical judgments about the nature of dreams, representing a significant advance in understanding while placing enormous responsibility on mental health professionals to accurately evaluate complex cases where reality and fantasy have become dangerously intertwined. Contemporary research in neuroscience and psychology continues to reveal new insights about the relationship between dreams and violent behavior, suggesting that our understanding of these phenomena is still evolving and that future discoveries may further change. How legal and medical systems approach cases involving supernatural claims about divine authorization for violence. If you're somehow still awake, which I doubt, you've just experienced one of the most disturbing collections of stories about the dangerous intersection of dreams and violence in human history. Tonight, we've explored cases spanning centuries and cultures, from ancient oracles whose drug-induced visions justified political assassinations, to modern defendants whose mental illness transformed religious dreams into justifications for unspeakable acts. We've seen how a teenage peasant girl's saintly visions became military campaigns, how a Nazi leader's mythological fantasies became industrial genocide, and how shared delusions in Salem turned teenage nightmares into legal executions. What these stories reveal is both fascinating and terrifying, that the boundary between divine inspiration and dangerous delusion has always been razor thin, and that society's willingness to accept or reject dream commands often depends more on political convenience and cultural context than on any objective criteria for distinguishing between genuine revelation and psychological disturbance. We've learned that the most dangerous dreams aren't necessarily the most violent ones. They're the dreams that tell us exactly what we want to hear, that confirm our existing prejudices, and that provide supernatural authorization for actions we're already inclined to take. When dreams become ways of avoiding moral responsibility rather than seeking genuine guidance, they can justify any atrocity while protecting perpetrators from psychological guilt. Perhaps most disturbing is how these cases demonstrate that dream-commanded violence often receives institutional support from legal, religious, and political authorities who find it convenient to validate supernatural claims that serve their interests. Joan of Arc became a saint because her violence served French nationalism. The Salem accusers were believed because their dreams justified eliminating social outsiders. Himmler's genocidal visions were accepted because they aligned with Nazi ideology. Before you drift off tonight, and hopefully you do drift off peacefully, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your corner of the world. And if you've ever had dreams that felt so real they seemed like commands or instructions, I'd be curious to hear about those experiences too. Though please keep it light, we've had enough darkness for one evening. If these stories of dream-commanded violence have captured your imagination in the most unsettling way possible, make sure you're subscribed, because next week we're exploring an entirely different kind of nocturnal mystery, the dreams that saved lives, revealed hidden treasures, and solved crimes that had baffled investigators for years. We'll discover how sleeping minds have been humanity's secret weapon for breakthrough discoveries and miraculous rescues. Until then, sleep well, dream peacefully, and remember, when voices in your dreams start giving you homework, especially the violent kind, it's probably time to have a conversation with someone in the waking world about whether those nocturnal instructions deserve to be followed or forgotten. Sweet dreams, everyone. See you in your dreams.